The creditor didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard the hinges screamed, and the two children sitting by the cold stove grabbed each other without making a sound because they had already learned that making sounds only made men like this angrier. You got until sunrise. He dropped the paper on the floor. Didn't hand it. Dropped it, the way you drop something that doesn't matter. After that, everything in this cabin belongs to the bank, including the stove. Adeline Crowe stood between him and her brother and sister and did not move. She was 24 years old. She had been holding this family together for 3 years with her bare hands, and she was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. And in that moment, staring at a man who had just walked into her home like he already owned it, she made a decision that would change everything. If you've ever had to make an impossible choice just to keep the people you love safe, stay with me. Because this story is for you. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to 1885. The paper on the floor said everything the creditor's face already had. Adeline didn't pick it up right away. She stood still, her hands loose at her sides, breathing through her nose the way she'd taught herself to do when panic started climbing up her throat. The creditor, a wide man named Gerald Pruitt, who smelled like tobacco and wet wool, was already moving around the cabin, looking at things, touching things, running his thick finger along the edge of her mother's old sewing table like he was pricing it in his head. Pruitt. Her voice came out steady. She was almost surprised. Miss Crowe. He didn't look at her. He picked up the small clock on the mantel, turned it over, set it back down a half-inch from where it had been, like that small displacement was its own kind of message. "My father is sick," she said. "You know that. The whole town knows that." "I do know that." He finally looked at her. His expression wasn't cruel exactly. It was something worse. It was indifferent. And the bank's been patient. 8 months patient. But winter's coming, and patience runs out same as everything else. Her brother Eli was 9 years old and trying very hard not to cry. She could hear it in the way he was breathing, those small, controlled inhales that children make when they're fighting something they don't understand. Her sister Clara was 7, and Clara had stopped trying to fight it and was just sitting with her knees pulled up and her face turned toward the wall. Adeline had raised them both since their mother died. Not in the romantic sense that people made it sound later when they told the story. She had raised them the real way, the way that meant. She was the one who got up at night when Clara had fever, the one who taught Eli to read from a single worn Bible because there were no other books, the one who worked the mining claim their father could no longer work, who stretched a small bag of cornmeal across 3 weeks, who told them everything was going to be fine in a voice she never quite believed herself. She picked up the paper. The debt was larger than she'd known. Her father, during the months when the pain was at its worst, and his thinking had gone cloudy from the medicine the doctor had left, had apparently signed an additional agreement she hadn't been told about. The number at the bottom made her stomach drop. That signature, she started, is legal, Pruitt said, had a witness and everything. He was sick. He didn't. Miss Crowe, he said her name like a door closing. "I'm not here to argue about what your father did or didn't understand. I'm here to tell you the terms. Sunrise. After that, my men come, and they take what's owed." He walked to the door, stopped. And this was the part she would remember longest, the part that would still make her hands tighten into fists. Years later, when she thought about it, he turned around and looked at her children, at Eli and Clara sitting by that cold stove. And he said, not unkindly, which made it worse, "You might want to think about making arrangements for the little ones. I know a family in town that takes in children for the county." Then he left. The door swung on the damaged hinge for a moment, cold air pushing through the gap, and then it stopped. Clara uncurled from the wall. "Addie," she said, "just that." Just her name. "It's fine," Adeline said. She was already folding the paper. "It's fine," I'm thinking. She wasn't fine. She was calculating. There was a difference, and she had gotten very good at the second one while pretending to do the first. The mining claim was worth almost nothing, now the good ore had run out 2 winters ago. Cabin itself was already collateral. She had $6.40 in a tin behind the loose stone in the fireplace, and a string of her mother's glass beads that might fetch another dollar in town if the right person was buying. Against a debt that had grown, with interest, to something she couldn't say out loud because she didn't want Eli to hear the number and understand what it meant. She put her brother and sister to bed, told them a story, the same story about a boy who found a magic river that she'd been telling for 2 years, changing the details each time so they wouldn't notice it was the same story. Clara fell asleep with her hand on Adeline's wrist. Eli stayed awake longer, watching her with those eyes that had gotten too old too fast. "Are we going to lose the house?" he asked. "Not tonight," she said. Which was true, which was also not the same as fine. She sat by the dead stove after they were asleep, and she thought very hard about very few options, and none of them were good. She could go to Reverend Marsh and ask for charity. She would rather have cut off her hand. Not from pride exactly. She had stopped being precious about pride somewhere around the second winter alone, but because charity from Reverend Marsh came attached to lectures and expectations, and the implication that she had done something wrong. End up where she was, and she was too tired for all of that tonight. She could go to Miller's boarding house and ask for work. Hannah Miller had offered twice, but the wages were $3 a week, and lodging was included, which meant Eli and Clara would be what? Left here? Taken somewhere? The county family that Pruitt had mentioned in that almost kind voice? No, she was still sitting there when she heard the wagon. It was late past 10, she thought, though the clock Pruitt had handled sat on the mantel silent because she'd never had the money to have it properly wound. The sound of wheels and hooves on frozen ground was unmistakable, though. Someone was on the road to the cabin and slowing down, which meant they were coming here, which at this hour meant either very good news or very bad. Adeline picked up the fire poker on her way to the door. She wasn't a woman who frightened easily, but she wasn't stupid either. She opened the door before the knock came. The man standing on her steps was not what she expected. He was tall but not imposingly so, broad through the shoulder in a way that looked like work rather than display. His coat was old good wool once, but worn at the elbows and missing a button at the collar. His hat was the kind that had been good 20 years ago. His hands, when he took the hat off, were rough and calloused in the specific pattern of a man who used them constantly. He looked, in short, like half the men in Cinder Hollow. Working men, struggling men. "Miss Crowe," he said. His voice was quiet, careful, like he was aware of the hour and the children sleeping somewhere behind her. "I know this isn't a decent time. I apologize for that." "It's not," she agreed. She didn't lower the poker. He noticed it, didn't react to it. "My name is Ronan Vale. I have a claim up past the North Ridge. I've been in the territory about 4 years. He paused. "I heard about your situation. The whole town's heard about my situation," she said. Mr. Pruitt doesn't believe in being subtle. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something drier than that. "No, he doesn't." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm going to say something that's going to sound wrong no matter how I say it, so I'm just going to say it plainly. I think plain is better. Usually," she said, "I'm proposing marriage." The cold air moved between them. Adeline stared at him. She wasn't a woman who went speechless easily either. But it took her a moment. "You don't know me," she said. "I know more than you'd think. I've been watching this valley for a while." He said it matter-of-factly, not like it was supposed to be romantic. "I know you worked that claim 3 seasons after your father couldn't. I know you kept 2 children fed through a winter that put 4 grown men in the ground. I know you paid the Hendersons' debt last spring when you could barely pay your own, because their youngest was sick and the mother was alone, and you thought no one was paying attention." Adeline said nothing. "I'm not saying this to flatter you," he continued. "I'm saying it because you should know what kind of proposition I'm making. I'm not looking for a decoration or a housekeeper. I'm looking for, he paused, seeming to search for the honest word, a partner. Someone who makes decisions, someone who doesn't break. What are you offering? She said. Her voice was flat. Business flat. She didn't have the patience for romance tonight. Your family's debt, cleared before morning. Provisions for the winter enough that nobody goes hungry. And passage for your father to a doctor in Denver, proper one, not the traveling man who sold him that medicine. He said this last part carefully, watching her face. In exchange for your hand. Legitimately. A proper marriage. And what do you get, she said, out of this? A poor mining claim? A sick father-in-law? 2 children that aren't yours. I get a wife who isn't going to faint at the first hard season, he said simply. Adeline looked at him for a long time. The poker was still in her hand, but her arm had lowered without her entirely noticing. He was strange. That was the honest assessment. Most men who came to a woman's door late at night with proposals weren't this careful about it. Most of them leaned. Most of them implied. This man was standing at a deliberate distance and holding his hat with both hands and waiting. Why tonight, she said. Pruitt just came today. I know, he met her eyes. I wanted to give you the time to think about other options first. I didn't want to be your first knock. I thought that was important. That stopped her. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over everything quickly, practically, looking for the catch. Because there was always a catch. Men who offered things always had catches. If I say no, she said, what happens? You say no, he said. I go back up the ridge. Your situation stays what it is, a pause. I won't pressure you. I won't come back. This is a single offer, and it's yours to take or leave. And if I say yes and then decide I made a mistake, something shifted in his face, harder to read now. That's a conversation we'd have to have then. It wasn't the reassurance she was looking for. But it was honest, and honesty at this point in her life was rarer and more valuable than reassurance. She thought about Clara's hand on her wrist. She thought about Eli's 2 old eyes. She thought about her father in the back room, smaller every week, the cough that had gotten wet in a way that frightened her. She thought about Gerald Pruitt turning the clock on the mantel and not putting it back in the right place. She thought about what her options actually were, stripped of feeling. $40, a string of glass beads. A mining claim worth nothing, a county family that took in children. I need until morning, she said. You have it. He put his hat back on. Started to turn away, Mr. Vale. He stopped. Why do you live up past the North Ridge, she said. There's nothing up there. Even the good timber's played out. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. I like the quiet, he said. He walked back to his wagon. She stood in the doorway and watched him go and listened to the wheels on the frozen ground until she couldn't hear them anymore. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the cold stove and she thought, and she added numbers and she thought again, and when the sky began to go gray at the edges, she walked to the back room and looked at her father. He was breathing, shallow but breathing. His hands on the blanket were thin now, in a way that frightened her more than anything Pruitt had said. She thought about what the man had offered. Not the debt payment, she had set that aside, because making a life decision based on the relief of a number felt dangerous. She thought about what he had said when she asked what he got out of it. A wife who isn't going to faint at the first hard season. It wasn't a love story. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. But it was something she understood. It was the language of survival, and she was fluent in it. She went and woke her sister first, told her there was going to be a change. Clara, who had learned not to ask too many questions, just looked at her with those serious eyes and said, "Are you going to be safe?" "I think so," Adeline said, which was the most honest thing she could say. Then she woke Eli and told him the same. He asked more questions. He was 9 and already couldn't help it. "Do you like him?" Eli asked. "I don't know him yet," she said. "Then why?" "'Cause sometimes," she said, and she stopped. and she tried to find the version of the truth that a 9-year-old boy could carry without it being too heavy. Sometimes you make a decision with what you know now, and you trust yourself to figure out the rest as you go. Eli thought about this. Then he said, with the devastating logic of children, "Is that what Mama did when she married Papa?" Adeline had no answer for that. She just pulled him close and held on for a moment. At sunrise, she packed one bag. Not because she had to, she chose to. One bag meant she was moving forward, not backward. It was the decision made physical. She walked outside to find the wagon already at the road. Ronan Vale was standing by the horses, and he turned when the door opened, and he watched her come down the steps with her single bag, and he did not look triumphant or relieved or possessive. He just nodded, like she'd confirmed something sensible. "Ready," he said. She looked back at the cabin, at Eli and Clara standing in the doorway. At the gap in the fence she'd been meaning to fix for a year. Cold morning light falling on all of it. "There are conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said. She turned to face him. "My family is not your charity case. They're my responsibility. You help them because we're a partnership, not because you own them." She held his gaze. "And I will not be managed, Mr. Vale. I won't be told what to think or who to talk to or when I'm allowed to speak." He looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. No qualification, no hesitation, she put her bag in the wagon. Climbed up, did not look back again, because if she looked back again, she would not be able to go. The wagon started moving. And whatever Adeline Crowe had been, a miner's daughter, a debt holder, a woman running out of road, she left it behind on those steps with her brother and sister watching, in a small Colorado settlement called Cinder Hollow, in the winter of 1885. She had no idea where this man was taking her. She had no idea that the road beyond the North Ridge didn't lead to a small claim or a modest cabin. She had no idea that every single thing she thought she knew about Ronan Vale was wrong. But she was about to find out. The wagon hit the first real ice about 2 miles past the settlement line, and Adeline grabbed the side rail hard enough to leave marks in her palm. Ronan didn't slow down. He adjusted his grip on the reins, shifted his weight slightly, and guided the horses through it like a man who had done this particular thing in this particular place so many times it had become something close to unconscious. The horses didn't panic either. That was the thing she noticed. Most horses on ice got stupid with fear. These two moved through it with their heads low and their steps deliberate, like they trusted the man holding the lines. She filed that away. She was filing a lot of things away. The road, if it could still be called, that climbed steadily into the pines after the ice patch. The trees here were old growth, the kind that blocked the early morning light and made the air taste different. Colder, cleaner. The settlement sounds faded behind them until the only things she could hear were the horses and the runners, and the wind moving through branches somewhere above. Ronan hadn't spoken since they left. She hadn't either. She told herself this was fine. They were strangers. Strangers didn't owe each other conversation, but the silence had a weight to it, and after another mile she found she couldn't just sit in it without knowing something. "How long is the ride?" she said. "Depends on the pass." He didn't look at her. His eyes were on the road ahead, and she was starting to understand that this was just how he drove total attention, no performance. If Blackthorn Pass is clear, half a day. If it's not, he paused longer. What does not clear mean? Snow came down early this year. Sometimes the north face drifts across, a pause, we'd camp and wait. She thought about this. She thought about sleeping in a wagon in a mountain pass with a man she had known for approximately one sunrise. Have you done that before? The camping and waiting. Yes, alone, usually. She looked at the side of his face. You do a lot of things alone, I did, he said. He said it plainly, without making it into a statement about her presence. Just a fact about a life that had apparently just changed. The road got worse before it got better. There were stretches where she wasn't sure it was a road at all, more like a suggestion of a direction through the trees, worn by repeated passage into something that approximated a track. She watched him navigate it without hesitation, without consulting any map or marker, and this was the second thing she filed away. You didn't learn a road like this from visiting it. You learned it from living near it, from using it constantly over years. The way he knew every rut, every place where the ground softened or hardened, every tree root that pushed up through the frozen surface, this was not the knowledge of a man with a small claim up past the North Ridge. This was something else. She didn't ask about it yet. Around midday, they stopped to water, the horses at a creek that hadn't fully frozen, just crusted at the edges with thin ice that the horses broke through casually. Adeline climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She'd been climbing in and out of things her whole life. She didn't need assistance and walked a few steps to stretch her legs. The view from here, even through the bare trees, was something. The settlement was invisible behind them. Ahead, the land kept rising into gray-white peaks that looked like they belonged to a different world entirely. Bigger than she'd imagined from below, everything looked bigger from inside it. Ronan was checking the horse's legs when she turned back, running his hand down the near horse's foreleg with practiced care, pressing at the joint, watching the horse's reaction. "Are they yours or rented?" she said. "Mine. They're expensive horses." He looked up at her. Something moved in his expression, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. "I've had them a while." That didn't answer what I said. He held her gaze. "No," he agreed. It didn't. They stood there for a moment with that between them. She didn't push it. Not because she was being polite. She wasn't particularly interested in politeness right now, but because she had noticed something. When she'd pressed him, his discomfort wasn't the discomfort of a man caught in a lie. It was the discomfort of a man who was deciding how much truth to give and in what order. There was a difference. She'd known liars. This didn't feel like that. It felt like a man who was carrying something he hadn't decided how to put down yet. "We should keep moving," he said. "If the pass is going to be a problem, I want to know before dark." She got back in the wagon. The pass was called Blackthorn. She'd heard the name distantly, in the way you heard the names of far places you'd never had reason to go. It sat at the top of a switchback climb that took the better part of an hour and left her hands white from gripping the rail. The trail here was genuinely dangerous, and she could see why. On the left, the mountain continued rising. On the right, the ground dropped away into a ravine that had no visible bottom from this angle. She did not look at the right side more than once. Ronan drove it at a pace that seemed reckless, but apparently wasn't, because the horses didn't stumble, and the wagon didn't slide. And she realized partway up that he was picking his line through each switchback corner with a precision that was almost mathematical, cutting the angle exactly, keeping the weight distributed, giving the horses the precise amount of slack they needed at each point. "You've done this in snow," she said, not meaning to say it out loud. "Yes." "In the dark?" A pause once, not by choice. "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment, his full attention on a particularly tight corner. When they were through it, he said, "Horse went lame halfway down. Had to walk them the rest of the way. Took most of the night." "What were you carrying?" Another pause, longer this time. "Medical supplies," he said, "for the workers' camp." She turned to look at him fully. "There's a workers' camp up here?" "Was," he said. "It's changed since then." She watched his face, but he had gone back to that careful blankness that she was beginning to recognize as his default when he'd said more than he meant to. She let it go. She was collecting pieces, and she could feel that they added up to something. She just didn't have enough of them yet. They reached the top of the pass just as the afternoon light began to go thin and pale. Adeline had been looking at mountains her whole life. She had grown up with them on every horizon. She thought she knew what they looked like, what they meant, what they contained. She did not expect what was on the other side of Blackthorn Pass. The valley opened below them, like something that had no business being there, enormous, protected on three sides by the mountain walls, the floor of it green-brown with late-season grass under a skin of early snow. There were trees, yes, but they were managed trees. She could see that even from up here, the spacing too deliberate to be natural. And there were buildings, not one or two, not a cabin and a barn. There were buildings scattered across the valley floor in a pattern that suggested something organized, something planned. Sawmill structures, she could identify those. Barns more than one. Cluster of smaller structures that looked like housing. And then, at the far end of the valley where the land rose slightly toward the eastern wall, something that was not a cabin at all. It was a lodge, timber and stone, 2 stories at least, with a covered porch that ran the full front width. It sat on the rise like it had grown there, like the land had offered it up specifically. She forgot to breathe for a moment. When she remembered, she turned to look at Ronan. He was watching her face. That in itself told her something. He wasn't looking at the valley. He'd seen the valley. He was watching her see it for the first time, and she couldn't read what he was feeling about that she wasn't sure it was pride exactly. It was something more complicated and quieter. Ronan Vale, she said slowly. The words came out careful, like she was setting them down one at a time. What exactly is this? He looked at the valley for a moment. Then back at her, and when he spoke, it was without the careful blankness, without the measured distance he'd been keeping all day. He looked for the first time, something she could only describe as braced. My name isn't Vale, he said. It's Blackthorn. Ronan Blackthorn. The cold air sat between them. Blackthorn, she said. Yes, as in Blackthorn Pass, my grandfather named it. She stared at him. The valley below them, the buildings, the sawmills, the lodge, the managed forest, all of it organized itself in her mind into a new shape. Not a mining claim, not a rough man with a rough life who happened to have expensive horses and perfect knowledge of a dangerous road. Something else entirely. You own this, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, all of it. Most of the territory you can see from here, he said. And some you can't. The rage came up so fast it surprised her. She'd been keeping herself steady all day, steady through the fear and the uncertainty and the miserable cold and the terrifying pass. Steady, the way she'd trained herself to be steady, because falling apart was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. But this you lied to me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. In her experience, the quietest version of her voice was the most dangerous one. I withheld. He said it steadily, not flinching from her eyes. There's a difference, not much of one. The difference is that nothing I told you was false. He turned on the wagon seat to face her more directly. I do have a claim up past the North Ridge. I do live in this territory. I am the man you spoke with last night, exactly as I presented myself. I just left out the part where you're one of the richest men in the territory, she said. Yes, why? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she hadn't expected. Because I needed to know if you'd say yes to me. She waited. My father died 4 years ago, he said. Before that, my mother. After the will was settled, I had 3 women come to Blackthorn Valley sent by their families, with letters and intentions and plans. Not one of them knew a single thing about me, not my habits, not my opinions, not what I thought was worth fighting for. They knew the timber holdings and the lodge and the valley, and they were prepared to marry those things and tolerate me as the attachment. He paused. I sent them all home, and then you chose a different approach, she said. You put on your worst coat and drove a woman's debt away, so she'd be grateful enough to say yes. He absorbed that. I chose you because I watched you work a claim alone in conditions that broke stronger people. I watched you make decisions for your family that you didn't have the support to make. I watched you help people who had nothing to give you in return. His voice stayed even, but something underneath it was not even at all. I wasn't buying your gratitude. I was trying to give you an honest choice, a choice where you were based on who I actually was instead of what I owned. I couldn't make an honest choice, she said, because you were dishonest with me. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that comes after someone has said something true that the other person cannot argue with. Ronan did not argue with it. You're right, he said. Just that. She looked at the valley below, the lodge, scale of everything she had married into without knowing what she was marrying into. She had come up here thinking she was making a practical arrangement with a working man. She had thought she understood the terms. She had thought for the first time in 3 years that she'd had a clear picture of what lay ahead of her. The picture had been completely wrong. She thought about the conditions she'd set at the wagon that morning. My family is not your charity case. I will not be managed. She'd thought she was negotiating from one kind of position. She'd been in a completely different one the whole time and hadn't known it. The feeling that produced was something she didn't have a clean word for, somewhere between foolish and furious, and something that ached in a way that was harder to name. I want to go home, she said. Yes. He picked up the reins. If that's what you want, I'll take you back. Today, right now, we turn around and I drive you to Cinder Hollow. He didn't say it with resignation or manipulation. He said it like a man reading from a contract. Your family's debt is already settled. The bank received payment this morning before we left. That doesn't change regardless of what you decide here. She stared at him. You paid it this morning? Before I agreed to anything. You had agreed, he said, last night on your porch. I said I needed until morning to decide, and you came out in the morning with a bag packed. Something shifted in his face. I figured that was deciding. She opened her mouth. Closed it, because he wasn't wrong. She had packed the bag. She had made the decision. She had climbed into the wagon. But the idea that he had moved on the debt before she'd given her final word. That was presumptuous, she said. It was, he agreed. I was trying to make sure your family was protected regardless, in case you changed your mind on the road. So even if I'd turned around at the pass, the debt would still be settled. He nodded once. Yes. She sat with this. The anger was still there, solid and real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But underneath it, she was doing what she always did, calculating. Stripping the feeling back to find the actual situation. The actual situation was this. A man who could have offered her wealth from the start had chosen not to, had chosen instead to be seen as he was without the money, and had made sure her family was protected before she'd committed to anything. His deception had been real. His reasoning for it was not nothing. It wasn't nothing. I'm not going back tonight, she said finally. Something in his posture shifted, barely perceptible. All right, this isn't forgiveness, she said immediately. This is, she stopped. I want to see it, what you actually are. And then I'll decide. He nodded, fair. And I have a new condition. Tell me, no more withheld information. She looked at him directly. I don't care if it's inconvenient or complicated, or if you think I'm not ready to hear it. It's relevant to my life, you tell me. He held her gaze. Agreed. I mean it, Ronan. So do I. She turned forward in the seat. Then drive. He drove. The descent into the valley was easier than the climb. The road here was better maintained, she noticed, graded and graveled in places, with drainage channels cut into the shoulders. Someone had spent serious money and time on this road. The kind of money you spent on infrastructure you intended to use for decades. As they came down into the valley floor, the scale of everything reconfigured itself. The sawmill was larger than she'd thought, 2 buildings actually, connected by a covered walkway. The workers' housing was a row of small but solid cabins, nothing like the collapsing structures she'd expected. The barn doors were painted. There were fences in good repair, a kitchen garden still showing the stubble of a late harvest, a smokehouse, a structure that might be a forge. And then they passed the first person she'd seen since Cinder Hollow. He was a man about 50, thick through the middle, standing near the sawmill with a ledger in his hands. When he saw the wagon, he straightened and looked at Ronan, and then his gaze moved to Adeline, and something complicated moved across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the careful blankness of a man who'd learned to keep his expressions controlled. Ronan raised one hand from the reins in a brief acknowledgement. The man with the ledger nodded. That's Harlan, Ronan said. He manages the mill operation. He's been with the family since before my father died. Does he know about... She gestured vaguely at the wagon at herself. No one here knows I was in Cinder Hollow, he said. As far as everyone at the valley is aware, I was riding the timber boundaries to the south. So I'm a surprise. Yes, she thought about being a surprise to a valley full of people who worked for the man sitting next to her. Thought about the way that ledger man's face had moved when he'd seen her. That's going to be interesting, she said dryly. Something in Ronan's expression shifted. It wasn't quite a smile. She wasn't sure she'd seen him smile yet, but it was in the territory. You have a gift for understatement, he said. I have a gift for getting through things, she said. Understatement just helps. The lodge was closer now, and she was not going to say beautiful, because she hadn't yet decided how to feel about it, and she didn't want her feelings contaminated by beauty. But it was well made, genuinely carefully well made. The stone foundation ran deep. She could see the thickness of it where the land dipped near the porch. The timber framing was old growth, heavy, the kind of construction designed to stand for 100 years. The windows there were real glass windows. Multiple panes caught the last of the afternoon light. Ronan pulled the wagon up to the front, and before he had tied the horses, a woman appeared on the porch. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back severely and an apron over a plain dark dress. Her face was organized into an expression of complete neutrality that Adeline recognized immediately as someone who had practiced it for a long time. Her eyes went to Adeline and stayed there with the unblinking focus of a woman cataloging everything as fast as she could process it. Mrs. Holt, Ronan said, this is Adeline. She'll be staying. Staying, Mrs. Holt said. The single word had a complicated cargo. My wife, Ronan said. The woman's neutrality didn't crack. It was better than that. It was deep. But Adeline saw her hands, which were folded in front of her apron, tighten slightly. Just slightly. I see, said Mrs. Holt. She'll need the east room prepared, Ronan said. He was climbing down from the wagon, moving to the horses' heads. He said it matter-of-factly, like this was any ordinary instruction. The east room, the woman repeated. If it's not too much trouble, Mrs. Holt, it's no trouble, she said, which they all three understood was not entirely true. She looked at Adeline for another moment. Then she said, with precisely calibrated courtesy, Welcome to Blackthorn Valley, ma'am. I'll have the room ready within the hour. She turned and went back inside. Adeline looked at Ronan. She hates me. She doesn't know you, he said. She has opinions about me. She has opinions about everything, he said. She'll come around. You sound very certain about that. He paused, half his attention on the horse he was unhitching. She came around on me, he said, after my father died, and she was waiting to see what kind of man I was going to be. It took about a year. He freed the second horse and ran his hand along its neck. So maybe not come around quickly. Adeline looked at the lodge. At the porch where Mrs. Holt had stood, at the windows where the last light was turning everything amber and cold. A year, she said, give or take. She picked up her single bag. Tell me there's a fireplace in the east room. 2, he said. She walked to the front door and let herself in without waiting for anyone to open it for her, because she had a feeling that the first several months here were going to be a long negotiation about exactly that kind of thing. Who opened doors for whom, and what it meant, and whether she was a wife or a guest or something that didn't have a clean word yet, and she might as well establish from the first minute how she intended to proceed. The inside of the lodge stopped her despite herself. Not because it was grand. It was not a showplace. The furniture was heavy and worn in the way of things that got used. The rugs had good colors that had faded slightly. The walls had hooks where coats actually hung, and a rifle that wasn't decorative, and a barometer and a map that was covered in pencil marks. It was the interior of a place where someone actually lived and worked. There was a desk in the main room with papers on it, organized in piles that suggested a system. There were boots by the door that needed resoling. There was a dog sleeping near the fire, a large, gray-muzzled old dog that opened one eye when she came in and then closed it again, apparently deciding she wasn't interesting enough to stand up for. It was nothing like what she'd expected a Blackthorn to live in. She didn't know whether that made her feel better or worse about everything. She found the stairs and the east room on her own. She wasn't going to wait for an escort. The room was larger than her entire cabin in Cinder Hollow. Clean, a little cold, with exactly 2 fireplaces as advertised and a window that looked out over the valley. She put her bag down on the chair by the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the shadows coming down the mountain walls. She had been awake since before the sunrise before this one. She had not eaten since the small breakfast she'd managed to put together before Pruitt's visit. Had it really been only yesterday, it felt like it had been a week. Her hands were stiff from gripping the wagon rail in the cold, and her feet were blocks of ice, and somewhere in the valley below there were workers, and a mill manager, and a housekeeper who all had opinions about the woman, who had appeared without warning to be the new Mrs. Blackthorn. There was a knock at the door. She expected Mrs. Holt. It was Ronan. He was holding a plate. Bread, some cheese, dried meat, nothing elaborate. He held it out like he wasn't sure if she'd take it. She took it. She was too hungry to be proud about it. "I should have stopped to eat on the road," he said. "I didn't think about it. Neither did I," she said, which was only half true. She'd thought about it but hadn't wanted to ask. He didn't come into the room. He stood at the door and she stood at the window with the plate, and there was a moment where the distance between them, which was still large, still undefined, still full of things that hadn't been said, felt very present. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "Why me?" She looked at him directly. There are women in this territory who come from money, who know how to manage a household like this, who wouldn't have to spend a year convincing your housekeeper they belong here. Could have had any of them. You said you sent 3 home, but that just means you chose not to marry anyone until now. She held his gaze. So why me specifically? Not the speech about watching me work the claim. The real reason. He was quiet for a long moment. Because, he said finally, when Pruitt walked into your house and treated everything in it like it was already his, including you, you didn't move. You stood between him and those children, and you held that poker, and you didn't show him a single thing he could use. He paused. I've been looking at people for years, trying to find someone who wouldn't disappear the first time something actually hard happened. Who wouldn't fold when the pressure came. This valley. He stopped, seemed to be choosing words carefully. It's not a quiet place to live, Adeline. There are things coming, decisions that need to be made that I can't make alone and stay the man I want to be. I needed someone who could see what was right without me having to explain it first. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a lot of weight to put on a woman you'd never spoken to, she said. Yes, he said. I know. She looked back at the window. Valley going dark. What things coming, she said. What decisions? There's a man named Aldrich coming from Denver in the spring, he said. He represents a railroad group and 3 eastern investors. They want to buy cutting rights to the north and east slopes. Full clear cut. They're projecting enormous returns in 18 months. And you, she said, I've been putting them off for 2 years. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was tired. The board thinks I should take the deal. There's an aunt, my father's sister, who has enough interest in the company to make things complicated if she decides to push. Adeline was quiet, fitting pieces together, the managed trees she'd noticed on the drive-in, the road in careful repair, the workers' housing that was actually solid. You've been running this valley differently than the investors want, she said slowly. For 2 years, and now the pressure is coming to a head. In the spring, he said, yes, she thought about the streams below Cinder Hollow, which had been running brown for 2 seasons from a clear-cut operation 40 miles north. Thought about the Henderson family, whose well had gone bad after the same operation. Thought about what stripped slopes did to ground that held water, to roads built over root systems, to communities downstream. She thought about a woman who could see what was right without being told first. I need to know everything, she said, about the company, about this valley, about what you've been doing for 2 years and why. She put the plate on the chair. Not tomorrow, when you're ready, but I need to know all of it. All right, he said, and Ronan, he waited. When this aunt comes from Denver, she said. What's her name? Lenora, he said. Lenora Blackthorn. When Lenora comes from Denver, she said, I'd like to have been here long enough to know what I'm walking into. He looked at her with something she still couldn't fully name. She's coming in 3 weeks, he said. She sent a letter before I left. 3 weeks. Adeline was doing the calculation before he finished the sentence. 3 weeks to learn a valley, a company, an operation, a set of relationships and histories and resentments she had no map for. 3 weeks to go from a woman with one bag in a cold east room to something that Lenora Blackthorn couldn't dismiss with a look. She had raised 2 children on $6 and stretched cornmeal to 3 weeks and worked a mining claim alone in conditions that broke stronger people. 3 weeks was something she could work with. Good night, Ronan, she said. He recognized it for what it was. Good night, Adeline. He closed the door. She stood by the window for a while in the dark, not lighting the lamp yet, just looking at the valley below where the first stars were coming out over the mountain walls. The old dog downstairs was probably still asleep by the fire. Mrs. Holt was somewhere in the lodge with her folded hands and her careful eyes and her year-long process of deciding things. Harlan, the mill manager, was in a cabin somewhere with his ledger and his opinions. And outside these walls, in a timber and stone valley hidden behind a mountain pass, there was an operation that had been holding a line against something large and lucrative and destructive, held by a single man in a worn coat who had apparently decided he needed help holding it. She pulled her single bag onto the bed and took out the only extra thing she'd brought that wasn't strictly necessary, a small, folded piece of paper that Eli had pushed into her hand as she was leaving, that she hadn't looked at yet. She opened it in the dark. It was a drawing. Eli's drawings were always ambitious and anatomically challenging. This one appeared to be a mountain, with a small stick figure at the top, and below it in his careful child handwriting, "Come back." Folded it back up and put it in her pocket. Then she lit the lamp and she began to learn Blackthorn Valley. 3 weeks felt like nothing when she started counting what she didn't know. The first morning, Adeline was up before anyone else in the lodge. Old habit, she'd been waking before dawn since she was 16, and there was no one else to start the fire. She found the kitchen by following the cold and the smell of banked coals, and she had coffee going before Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway at 5:30 with an expression that suggested she had never in her life been beaten to her own kitchen and wasn't sure how she felt about it. "I can do that," Mrs. Holt said. "I know," Adeline said. "I already did." A pause. Mrs. Holt came in and poured herself a cup and stood on the opposite side of the kitchen, and they drank in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least honest. "How long have you been here?" Adeline asked. "At the Valley." 31 years. Mrs. Holt said it the way people say things they've said so many times the words have worn smooth. "I came with the first Blackthorn, Edmund, Ronan's grandfather." "You knew his father." "I raised his father," she said. Flat. Matter of fact. "And I was here when this valley was 40 acres and a mill shed and 4 men who weren't sure they'd make it through the first winter." Adeline looked at her over the rim of the cup, and now someone you don't know is sitting in your kitchen. Mrs. Holt's eyes were sharp, gray and sharp, and they did not look away. "You're direct," she said. "I don't have time not to be." The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have no quarrel with direct." She set her cup down. "I have quarrel with disruption. I'm not here to disrupt anything," Adeline said. "Everything that comes in changes what's already here, Mrs. Holt said. "Whether it means to or not." She picked up her cup again. "The question is whether the change is worth the disruption." She looked at Adeline steadily. "I don't know the answer to that yet. Neither do I," Adeline said. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Fractional. Almost nothing. But Adeline had spent 3 years reading the faces of people who were deciding whether to trust her, and she recognized the specific quality of this shift. It wasn't warmth. It was the beginning of the possibility of warmth, which was different and which Adeline would take. "Breakfast is at 6:30, Mrs. Holt said, and turned back to the stove. Ronan appeared at 6:15, already dressed, his hair not quite managed, looking like a man who had been awake for a while. He stopped when he saw Adeline at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and a stack of papers she had found on the desk in the main room and brought to the table. He started. "The mill production reports from the last 2 years, she said. "And what I think is your correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, though some of it's hard to follow because whoever writes their letters hates punctuation." She looked up at him. "You said when I was ready. I was ready at about 2 in the morning." He sat down across from her. "The East Slopes," she said, pointing to a number in the production report. "You've been cutting about 40% of what the North operation runs." "Why?" He leaned forward to look. "Watershed. The East Slopes feed into Carver Creek, which runs through 4 settlements below the valley before it hits the river. If we cut heavy on those slopes, the runoff changes. Spring melt gets unpredictable. The settlements below us get flooding or drought depending on the year. And the investors know this? They know. They've decided it's not their problem." She set the paper down. "What does Harlan think?" Something in Ronan's expression moved. "Harlan has been with the company since my father. He's good at the mill. He understands timber yield, production scheduling, drying times. He doesn't pause. He doesn't think the same way about what happens downstream." "Does he think you're wrong to hold back?" "He thinks I'm being sentimental," Ronan said. "He doesn't say it directly, but yes. And when Lenora comes with the investors, Harlan will be polite to me, and he will also answer every question they ask completely honestly." His voice was even, but there was something tired underneath it again. "He's not disloyal. He just believes in the numbers." Adeline looked at the papers. The numbers were actually there. She'd been reading them. The Valley's operation was profitable, legitimately profitable, not barely surviving. Ronan's careful cutting strategy had preserved the forest density in a way that would allow continued harvesting for decades rather than the 5 to 8 year stripping cycle she'd seen happen to 3 other timber operations in the territory. He was making less money now in exchange for making money for a very long time. "You need to write this down," she said. "Not the way it's in these reports, which are useful, but they're mill numbers. You need something that shows what sustainable cutting looks like over 20 years versus the clear-cut returns over 5. Something a territorial official could read and understand." "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to 3 weeks, Ronan." He looked at her. "You have 3 weeks before Lenora arrives," she said. "That's what you told me last night. So let's stop meaning to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been here one night." "I know," she met his eyes. "I'm not trying to take over. I'm trying to understand what I walked into, and what I'm seeing is that you've been fighting this alone for 2 years, and it's starting to show." She said it plainly, not unkindly. "You need someone to think out loud with, so let's think." Breakfast came and went. Harlan appeared and was introduced to Adeline with a handshake that was firm and professional and told her absolutely nothing about what he actually thought. 2 other workers came through the kitchen for their meal, younger men, deferential to Ronan, curious about her in the sideways manner of people who'd learned not to stare. She caught both their names and filed them. The days that followed were not graceful. She made mistakes, constantly small ones, mostly, but they accumulated. She called the East Drainage by the wrong name for the first 4 days. She tried to help with something in the sawmill and misread a piece of equipment in a way that Harlan corrected with patient condescension that she swallowed without reacting to because she needed to learn more than she needed to be right. She underestimated how cold the valley got at night and how different cold was when you were at elevation rather than in a settlement. And she woke twice in the first week with the fire down and lay shivering under blankets rather than get up and deal with it because she was too tired to move. She was honest with herself about all of it. She'd always found that easier than people expected the honesty about her own failures, because when you had no margin for error, you couldn't afford to pretend errors weren't happening. What she didn't make mistakes about was people misses. Holt thawed by degrees, and Adeline was careful not to push it. She let the older woman lead in the kitchen and asked questions instead of offering opinions, and learned, over several early mornings and several cups of shared coffee, that Mrs. Holt had an opinion about every person who had ever set foot in Blackthorn Valley and would share those opinions if approached correctly. Adeline approached correctly. She learned that Harlan had been passed over for a management position under Ronan's father and had never entirely let it go. She learned that the two younger workers' brothers, Cade and Pete Sorrells, were good men with families in a settlement 2 days' ride south, and that they sent money home every week without fail. She learned that Ronan's father had been a harder man than Ronan, brilliant but difficult, prone to silence and sudden decisions that he explained to no one. She learned this last one from the way Mrs. Holt talked about Edmund Blackthorn carefully, the way you talked about something that had both made you and hurt you and had been gone long enough that you could finally start to separate the two. Ronan, meanwhile, was learning that thinking out loud had a different quality when someone was actually listening. He started bringing papers to the kitchen table after dinner. Not every night he wasn't that easy, and she hadn't expected him to be. But the conversation about the east drainage led to a conversation about the replanting schedule, which led to a longer conversation about what a 20-year plan actually looked like, written out in a form that wasn't just numbers in a ledger. She pushed him on specifics when he got abstract. He pushed back when she simplified too hard. 3 times in the first 2 weeks, they ended up in genuine arguments that neither of them fully won, and she thought that was probably healthy even when it was frustrating. She wrote letters to Eli and Clara. She had Ronan's account with the delivery rider, arranged so letters came and went on a weekly schedule, and she was meticulous about it. Eli's letters back were short and large-lettered and full of questions she couldn't always answer. Clara's were longer and more careful, and told her things about the cabin and their father in the selective way that Clara had always reported bad news, giving her the information she needed while trying to protect her from the worst of it. Their father's health had stabilized. Not improved, she wasn't going to pretend that was the word, but the real doctor in Denver, the one Ronan had arranged and paid for on his private account, had given him a treatment that was managing the worst of it. She held on to that. 10 days in, Ronan asked her to ride the east boundary with him. She said yes before she thought about it, which was probably the right instinct. She'd been confined to the valley floor and the lodge, building her picture of Blackthorn from papers and conversations and what she could see from the windows. She needed to see the actual land. He put her on the second horse, not the wagon horses. A different animal, a brown mare called Hazel, who was apparently steady and forgiving of riders, who were competent but not exceptional. Adeline was competent. She'd ridden her whole life. She just hadn't ridden anything as well-bred as this, and she could feel the difference in the first 100 yards. "She'll test you once," Ronan said, watching her settle. "Just to see, I know," Adeline said. "I've met this horse before." Different form. He looked at her. "She's like Mrs. Holt," she said, just with 4 legs, the almost smile again. A little more than usual this time. The east boundary ride took most of the day. He showed her the drainage patterns he'd described at the kitchen table, and seeing them in the actual landscape was different from reading about them. She could see exactly where the land tilted, where water would gather, where unstable soil sat just under the thin root cover. She could see the difference between the areas that had been selectively cut, where the remaining trees still held the ground, and one section on the far southeast edge where clear cutting had happened before Ronan's father died, and where the slope was still raw and slumping 8 years later. "The settlement at the base of that slope," she said. "Are there people there?" 12 families, he said. "Carver Creek Settlement. They've been rebuilding their lower fence every spring for 8 years because the melt keeps taking it. Do they know it's connected to this? Some of them have figured it out. His voice had something in it she was starting to recognize as his version of anger, very contained, not loud. The previous operators told them the slope was already unstable when they bought it. That was a lie. She looked at the raw slope and thought about 12 families rebuilding a fence every spring and not knowing why. Thought about what it would mean to those families if the north and east slopes above them got stripped the same way. When Aldrich comes with the railroad investors, she said, he's going to have numbers. Good numbers. Numbers that make the clear-cut deal look like the obvious right decision. Yes, Ronan said. So you need something that isn't a number, she said, half to herself. You need the families. He looked at her. You need the people from Carver Creek in that room, she said. Or at least their story in that room. Because the investors can argue with a projection, but they can't argue with a fence that gets destroyed every spring. She paused. And the territorial officials, the ones who have authority over land use agreements they're elected. They need votes from settlements like Carver Creek. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. That would require going to Denver, he said. For the board meeting, she turned to look at him. I know, Lenora will be there, I know. You've been here less than 2 weeks. Ronan, she held his gaze. Do you think waiting longer would have made Lenora easier to face? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. They rode back in the early afternoon, and she spent the evening writing. Not a letter to Eli. Something longer. More organized a summary of what she understood about the valley's drainage situation, the downstream impact, what she'd seen on the east boundary. Framed not in timber terms, but in terms that a person who lived near water and had a fence and a kitchen garden would understand immediately. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with it yet. But she believed in having things written down. The letter from Lenora Blackthorn arrived on a Tuesday, 13 days after Adeline had come to the valley. It came with the weekly rider. Mrs. Holt brought it to the main room where Adeline was at the desk, and Ronan was standing near the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. And she set it on the desk with an expression that was the closest thing to sympathy Adeline had seen from her. Ronan opened it. Read it. Set it down. She's coming Friday, he said. 3 days early, Adeline took the letter and read it herself. It was 3 pages, written in a hand that was beautiful and deliberate, and very clearly designed to demonstrate education and status in every loop in serif. The language was polished in a way that made it harder, not easier. To read the actual meaning was buried under so much courtesy that you had to strip it away to find the demand underneath. The demand was simple. Lenora was bringing 2 company directors and a man named Carver Aldrich, who was identified as a representative of the Denver Pacific Railroad Investment Group, and she expected a full operational review upon arrival. And she expected Ronan to have his position on the expansion contract ready to present. She's doing it on purpose, Adeline said, coming early. Yes, she wants to catch you unprepared, or she wants to catch whoever he stopped. Whoever you married, Adeline said evenly. She wants to see what she's dealing with before she can be managed. He looked at her. I wasn't going to say managed. Still what she wants. Adeline set the letter down. What do you know about Aldrich, the railroad man? Smart. Well-funded. He's done 3 expansion deals in the territory in the last 4 years, and 2 of them left the land in a condition that's going to take 50 years to recover. He paused. He has a reputation for being reasonable in conversation. His contracts tell a different story. Does he know you? We've met twice. He thinks I'm sentimental. The same word Harlan had used, and she noticed that Ronan noticed she noticed. It's what they call men who think about what happens after the money. She stood up. I need to send a letter today, before the rider leaves. To whom? Carver Creek Settlement, she said. I need to know who speaks for those 12 families. He was looking at her with that expression she hadn't fully named yet. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was something else, something that sounded almost like he was still calibrating, still adjusting to the fact of her. I know, she said. Write me an introduction. Something that tells them I'm someone worth writing back to. He wrote the introduction. She wrote the letter. The writer left with both. Wednesday and Thursday, she spent in a sustained push through the company records that she hadn't had time for in the first 2 weeks. Ronan sat with her for the first night and then let her work alone because she was faster without explanation. And by Thursday evening, she had the full picture, not just the east boundary situation, but the whole financial structure of Blackthorn Timber. The board composition, the inheritance agreements, the existing contracts and their terms, the outstanding negotiations. She also found something she hadn't expected. It was in a secondary ledger, one she'd almost missed because it was filed behind the primary production records. She pulled it out and stared at it for a long time without saying anything. It was a record of payments, going back 3 years. Small, regular amounts to 7 different names, not workers. The names weren't in any worker list. Settlements, she realized after a moment, not people. Communities. The Carver Creek settlement had a line. So did 3 others she hadn't heard of, and 2 she had. Ronan had been making quiet payments to settlements affected by previous operations on Blackthorn land. Money that didn't appear anywhere in the formal accounts. Not charitable donations, they were recorded as land remediation expenses, buried under a category that Harlan's ledger would have treated as operational waste. She took the ledger to the main room where Ronan was at the window again. It was something he did, stood at the window at night looking at the valley, and she'd stopped wondering if it was deliberate or just habit. She set the ledger on the table. He looked at it. Something moved across his face. "You didn't tell me about this," she said. "No. Is this what you called the Carver Creek situation?" "Part of it." He picked up the ledger and held it for a moment, not opening it. "The Carver Creek fence. The remediation work on their lower fields after the 1,882 melt. Some medical expenses from the following spring when the water quality." He stopped. "Yes, Ronan." She kept her voice steady. "This is evidence. That you knew there was damage, and you accepted responsibility, and you tried to address it." She looked at him. "Why isn't this in the formal accounts?" He set the ledger down. "Because if it's in the formal accounts, it becomes a legal admission that the operations caused harm, and Lenora and the board could use it to argue that I've been making unauthorized payments out of company funds." A pause. "Which I have been." She absorbed this. "How much?" He told her the number. It was not a small number. "Does Lenora know about this ledger?" she said. "I don't know." He met her eyes. "I don't know what she knows." Friday morning came gray and cold, and Adeline was dressed before 6. She wore the best thing she had, which was a dark blue dress that was clean and well-made and several years old, and she stood in front of the small mirror in the east room and looked at herself without particular judgment. She was not going to look like a woman from Denver. She was not going to look like what Lenora Blackthorn had in mind for the wife of a major timber company heir. There was nothing she could do about that, and she was not going to exhaust herself trying. What she could do was stand straight. She had always been good at standing straight. Mrs. Holt appeared at her door with something draped over her arm. She held it out without preamble, a shawl, dark green, beautifully made, the kind of thing that cost real money. "It was Caroline Blackthorn's," Mrs. Holt said. "Ronan's mother." Adeline looked at it. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, Mrs." Holt said, "Take it." Adeline took it. She put it around her shoulders, and the older woman looked at her for a moment with those sharp gray eyes. "Stand the way you stand," Mrs. Holt said. "Don't try to stand like them. They'll know the difference, and it'll make you smaller." She paused. "The way you stand already is better." Adeline looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt." "Margaret," the woman said. At this point, the carriage arrived at 11, was exactly what she'd expected, and also somehow more. 4 horses, well matched, driven by a man in a coat that probably cost more than the Cinder Hollow cabin. The carriage itself was black and polished to a finish that caught even the dull winter light. It pulled up to the lodge in the way expensive things, pulled up to places not arriving so much as installing itself. Adeline stood on the porch. Ronan stood beside her. She could feel the tension in him without touching him. He was doing what she recognized as his version of bracing, that stillness that was controlled in a way that took effort. She resisted the impulse to say anything, because anything she said right now would land wrong. She just stood there on his left and made sure her spine was straight. The carriage door opened. Lenora Blackthorn descended the steps with the ease of a woman who had been descending from carriages her entire life. She was perhaps 55 tall, with a bearing that communicated expense and expectation in equal measure. Her coat was gray wool trimmed with dark fur. Her hat was exact. Her face, when she turned toward the porch, was arranged in a smile that reached all the right points and communicated absolutely nothing warm. Behind her came two men in business dress, the directors. Adeline guessed, and then a third man, smaller, with the alert eyes and careful posture of someone who spent a great deal of time watching rooms. Aldrich, Ronan. Lenora's voice carried perfectly across the cold air. She climbed the porch steps and kissed his cheek with the precision of someone performing the correct action rather than wanting to. Then she turned to Adeline. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was thorough and it was fast, and it told Adeline that Lenora Blackthorn was very good at assessment and had just completed one. "And you must be Adeline," Lenora said. "I am," Adeline said. "I've heard so little about you." The smile stayed in place. "Ronan has always been private about personal matters." "He has," Adeline agreed. "I find it's one of his better qualities." Beat, small, nearly invisible. Lenora's smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes recalculated. "How charming," she said. They went inside. The meeting that afternoon was held in the main room, which Ronan had arranged with maps and production documents, and a fire that was large enough to be welcoming without being ostentatious. Harlan was present, seated to one side with his own ledger, wearing the expression of a man who had been waiting for this meeting for 2 years. 2 directors arranged themselves near Lenora. Aldrich took the chair nearest the maps, and she noticed he spent his first 3 minutes looking at the maps rather than at anyone in the room, which told her something about how he operated. Lenora opened. "The board has been patient," she said, addressing Ronan, "but the Aldrich proposal has been on the table for 18 months, and the investors have made clear that patience has a natural end." She was completely pleasant about it. That was one of her methods. Adeline was already seeing the pleasantness that made it impossible to push back without seeming unreasonable. The numbers, as Carver can confirm, represent an exceptional opportunity. Aldrich nodded with the confirmatory modesty of a man who knew the numbers by heart and didn't need to say so. Ronan presented his position, the sustainable cutting model, the 20-year projections, the value of preserved forest infrastructure for long-term contracts. He was clear, and he was specific, and he was, Adeline could see, also increasingly isolated in the room. Harlan's responses were technically accurate and subtly undermining. The 2 directors asked questions that weren't really questions. Lenora listened with her smile maintained, and her eyes moving between Ronan and Adeline with the measuring quality of someone conducting a different assessment than the one being discussed. And then Lenora set her cup down and said, in that pleasant, carrying voice, "I wonder if we might speak practically for a moment." She was looking at Ronan, but her gaze moved to Adeline. "About the future of this company under current leadership. Because the board certain concerns." "What concerns?" Ronan said. "About judgment," Lenora said. "About the kind of impulsive decisions." She let the word sit there. "That might indicate a pattern we need to consider carefully." "Which decisions?" Ronan said, his voice completely flat. "Well," Lenora looked at Adeline with that perfect smile. "Let's start with the most recent one. The room went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happened when everyone in the room understood what was happening, and no one was sure how it would resolve." Adeline looked at Lenora Blackthorn and felt something settle in her chest, not calm exactly, but the thing that lived underneath calm, the deep steadiness that had gotten her through her mother's death. and 3 winters alone, and Gerald Pruitt dropping a paper on her floor and a mountain pass in the dark. "Mrs. Blackthorn," she said. Her voice was even. "I understand you have concerns about the company's direction, and those are legitimate to raise with the board. But if your concern is with me specifically, I'd prefer you raise it directly rather than using me as a rhetorical point." She held Lenora's gaze without blinking. "So please, say what you mean." The silence this time was different. Aldrich's alert eyes moved from Lenora to Adeline with the expression of a man who had just encountered something he hadn't calculated. Lenora's smile didn't falter, but it changed quality. It went from pleasant to careful. "I mean," she said, with the precise emphasis of someone who had just decided to stop being subtle, that this company is a 100-year institution, and its leadership represents significant responsibilities that cannot be managed impulsively. "I mean that the board has questions about whether recent personal decisions reflect the kind of judgment that Blackthorn Timber requires." "I see," Adeline said, "and what would you like to know?" Lenora blinked. "Just once, very controlled." "About the judgment," Adeline said. "You have questions. I'm here, ask them." A pause. And then Aldrich, very quietly, almost to himself, said, "Well." Lenora set her teacup down. "The board needs to be satisfied," she said, "that personal relationships within the company's leadership structure meet a certain standard, that they represent and strengthen the Blackthorn name." "And you don't believe I meet that standard," Adeline said. "I believe," Lenora said carefully, "that the board would benefit from understanding more about your background, your family, your qualifications for a role of this." "My father is a miner," Adeline said. "His claim didn't produce and he's been sick for 3 years. My mother died when I was 19. I worked the claim and raised my brother and sister and kept the family solvent on almost nothing for 3 years before I came here." She said it directly, without apology, without shame. "I have no formal education past what a frontier settlement offered. I have no family connections that are useful to you. I have no money of my own." The room was silent. "What I have," she said, "is a thorough understanding of what happens to settlements when timber operations strip the land above them. I have 3 weeks of study of this company's operations, its contracts, its outstanding obligations, and its 20-year position. And I have a specific knowledge of the Carver Creek families and 4 other settlements below this valley who will be directly affected by the Aldrich proposal." She looked at Aldrich. "Were they in your projections, Mr. Aldrich? The downstream settlements?" Aldrich looked at her with those alert eyes. "Land remediation costs are factored." "The people," she said, "not the costs. The 12 families in Carver Creek who have rebuilt their lower fence every spring for 8 years because of what an operation like yours did to the slope above them." She didn't raise her voice. "Were they in your projections?" A silence. "Because I've written to them," she said. "And I expect a response before the end of this week." Lenora had been watching this with an expression that had moved past its practiced pleasantness into something more genuine, not quite respect, not yet, but its precursor. The recalibration of someone who had come to a room expecting one thing and found another. "It's very spirited," Lenora said, "but the board's concerns aren't addressed by." "There's also the matter of the inheritance clause," one of the directors said. He said it to Ronan, not to Adeline, which was its own statement. He was a lean man with silver at his temples who had been quiet until now. His name was Whitmore. She'd caught it in the introductions. The board's legal counsel has reviewed the original Blackthorn Charter. There are provisions regarding marriage that may be relevant to the current discussion. Ronan went very still beside her. Adeline looked at Whitmore. "What provisions?" Whitmore looked at Lenora, who produced a document from the bag beside her chair with the timing of someone who had been waiting to produce it. She set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing a piece on a board. "Edmund Blackthorn's original charter," she said, "included language regarding the conditions under which the primary heir's marriage could be recognized by the board in relation to company leadership." The pleasant smile was back. The language is specific about what constitutes a union that strengthens the company rather than complicates it. She pushed the document across the table toward Ronan. He picked it up. His face told her nothing, which meant things were bad enough that he was working hard not to let them show. Adeline kept her eyes on Lenora. "May I see it?" she said. Lenora's eyes moved to her. There was something in them now, not hostility, something more complicated. Interest, maybe. The particular interest of a predator who had just discovered the prey was not running. "Of course," she said. Ronan passed the document to Adeline. She read it. Not quickly, she was not going to rush this, not going to show that she was rattled. Even though something cold was moving through her chest, because the language was dense and legal, and she was reading it for the first time, while everyone in the room watched her face. She read it again, and then she found it. It was in the third paragraph of the second page, in language that had been written to last a century, and had used exactly the kind of careful phrasing that could mean several different things depending on who was reading it and what they needed it to say. The clause required that the primary heir's marriage demonstrably strengthen Blackthorn timber through recognized territorial service or community standing, or the board retained the right to review the heir's sole authority over company decisions. That was what Lenora had built her strategy on, but there was another line. 3 sentences later, and Adeline read it twice to be certain. She set the document down. "The clause has a remedy provision," she said. The room went quiet again. Lenora's smile held. The board's interpretation of the language. "The language says what it says," Adeline said. "It doesn't require interpretation. If the marriage can be demonstrated to strengthen the company through recognized territorial service," she looked at Whitmore, the director who had raised it, "the challenge to the heir's authority is void." She looked at the document again. "Are there territorial officials at the Denver meeting?" "The one you're proposing for the board review." Whitmore glanced at Lenora. "The Territorial Land Commissioner has been invited, yes." "Standard procedure for operations of this scale." Adeline nodded once. Something was moving in her chest that was not quite what she had expected to feel in this moment. It was not triumph. It was the particular focus that came when she could see the path forward through difficult terrain, and the only question was whether she had the strength to walk it. She looked at Ronan. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. She didn't have the word for it yet, but it was not nothing. "Then we'll be at the Denver meeting," she said. She said it to the room. She said it like a woman who belonged in the room, which was the only way she knew how to say things. Lenora looked at her for a long moment. The smile was still in place, but it had gone complicated, layered with something that wasn't part of the performance. Up her teacup. "I look forward to it," she said. The meeting ended an hour later without resolution on the expansion contract, which was its own kind of outcome. Aldrich shook hands with Ronan at the door and looked at Adeline with those alert eyes and said, "Your wife is thorough, Mr. Blackthorn." "Yes," Ronan said, "she is." They watched the carriage take Lenora and the directors to the guest quarters that Ronan had arranged in the workers' building, and then they were alone on the porch in the cold, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "The Denver meeting is in 11 days, he said. "I know." "You've never been to Denver." "I've never been to a lot of places," she said. "That hasn't stopped me yet." He looked at her. The expression from before was still there, or something like it. "Adeline, what?" "The remedy provision," he paused. "When did you find it?" "About 3 sentences before I told you about it," she said. A beat, and then for the first time since she'd known him, Ronan Blackthorn laughed. It was short and surprised sounding, like it had come out before he'd had time to decide about it, and it changed his face entirely into something that looked younger and less managed and completely real. She felt something move in her chest at the sound of it, and she filed that away too, though she wasn't yet sure what category it belonged in. 11 days, she said again. 11 days, he agreed. She went inside to write her response to Carver Creek. The response from Carver Creek came in 2 days, which was faster than she'd expected and slower than she'd hoped. It was written by a woman named Ruth Calloway, who identified herself as the settlement's elected speaker, a position Adeline hadn't known existed in frontier settlements, but which, when she thought about it, made complete sense. Because someone had to speak, or nothing would ever get decided. Ruth's letter was one page, direct, written in a hand that had clearly learned penmanship from a practical teacher rather than a finishing school. She described the fence situation with the specific irritation of someone who had been dealing with it long enough that the irritation had gone from hot to cold. She described the water quality problem in 1883 in the careful language of someone who had learned to be careful about accusation, because accusation without power behind it just made enemies. And at the bottom, in a sentence that Adeline read 3 times, she wrote, "We have been waiting for someone from the valley above us to acknowledge what they already know. If you are that person, we would like to meet you." Adeline wrote back the same afternoon. She told Ruth Calloway the truth, that she had been at Blackthorn Valley for less than 3 weeks, that she was still learning what she didn't know, and that she could not make promises on behalf of the company because the company's future direction was currently being contested. What she could say was that she had seen the east boundary and understood the drainage situation and believed it was connected to what Carver Creek had been experiencing, and that she intended to be in Denver for a board meeting in 11 days and intended to say so there. She also said that if Ruth Calloway or anyone from the settlement wanted to send testimony written, signed, specific, she would carry it to Denver herself. Ruth's second letter arrived in 4 days. It contained 7 signed statements from Carver Creek families. It also contained a note from Ruth that said only, "Don't let them bury this in a footnote." Adeline put the letters in the inside pocket of her coat and didn't tell Ronan about them yet. Not because she was keeping secret she wasn't Ronan. She didn't withhold things, but because she was still building the argument, still fitting the pieces together. And she'd learned that half-formed plans presented too early became other people's property to argue about before they were strong enough to defend. The 9 days between Lenora's visit and the Denver departure were the most compressed of her life, and her life had contained some genuinely compressed periods. Lenora and the directors remained at the Valley for 3 of those days, which was 3 days longer than comfortable. Lenora was perfectly civil at every meal, which was its own kind of pressure. She asked Adeline questions about her family and her background with the pleasant interest of someone collecting information. And Adeline answered honestly because she had nothing to hide and because she had noticed that the only thing that seemed to actually discomfit Lenora was directness, which was the one thing Adeline had in unlimited supply. The directors were less interesting than they thought they were. Whitmore had a legal mind, and she could work with legal minds. The other one, Fairchild, was a man who had inherited his position and spent most of his energy protecting it, which made him predictable. Aldrich ate breakfast early and alone, which she respected, and twice she caught him looking at the production maps on the wall of the main room with an expression that was more complex than his smooth professional manner suggested. On the second evening, she found him there alone, standing in front of the east boundary section of the map with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "Mr. Aldrich," she said. He turned that alert look. Mrs. Blackthorn. She had not gotten used to the name yet. She suspected this was the kind of thing that took longer than 3 weeks. "You're looking at the east drainage," she said. "I'm looking at the watershed notation," he said. "I didn't put it there. It's in your husband's handwriting, I think." "He's marked every drainage line in this section." "He has," she said. "He's been doing that for 4 years." Aldrich looked at the map for a moment. "I've done a great many land deals in this territory, Mrs. Blackthorn," he said, "and I'll tell you something that I wouldn't say in the meeting room because it wouldn't be productive." He paused. "Most of the men I negotiate with have already decided what they want to do before I arrive. Mr. Blackthorn is genuinely trying to make a different kind of decision." "Yes," she said, "he is. The board isn't going to let him," Aldrich said. It was not a threat. It was stated as a simple fact, the way he might state a drainage notation. Board doesn't have sole authority, she said. He looked at her then, the same recalibrating expression she'd seen from him during the meeting. The inheritance clause, she confirmed. He looked back at the map. You found the remedy provision fast, he said. I read quickly. The board's legal counsel didn't find it for 2 weeks. He said it without particular emphasis, but she heard the implication. I wasn't looking for something to use, she said. I was trying to understand what I was reading. Those are different approaches. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What is your proposal, Mrs. Blackthorn? Not the sustainable cutting argument. I understand that argument. I've heard it from Ronan twice. What is your specific proposal? She looked at the map. Come to the Denver meeting, she said. Hear what the territorial commissioner says. And then make your assessment. That's not a proposal, he said. That's a request to wait. It's a request to have complete information before you make a permanent decision, she said. You build railroad infrastructure, Mr. Aldrich. You know what incomplete site surveys cost. He was quiet again. It was a different quality of quiet than most people's silences, the kind that happened when real thinking was occurring rather than reaction. I'll be at the Denver meeting regardless, he said. That was always the plan. I know, she said. I'm asking you to listen as well as attend. He looked at her for a moment with those alert eyes. Then he picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. Good night, Mrs. Blackthorn, he said, and walked out. She stood at the map for a while after he left. She didn't know what to make of Carver Aldrich yet. He was not what she'd expected, which she'd learned by now, to treat as useful information rather than reassurance. Lenora's carriage left on the third morning. Lenora said goodbye to Adeline on the porch with that practiced kiss in the air beside the cheek, and a look that was, finally, honest, not warm. Nothing like warm, but stripped of the performance. Just two women looking at each other and taking a clear measurement. Denver will be more formal than this, Lenora said quietly. Just to her, not to Ronan, who was speaking with the directors by the carriage. I understand, Adeline said. I want you to understand something else. Lenora's voice stayed low and even. I am not your enemy because I dislike you. I don't dislike you. I am concerned about this company, which I have watched my brother build and my nephew inherit, and which I believe is being steered toward decisions that will damage it permanently. She held Adeline's gaze. Your husband is a good man who thinks too long and acts too slowly. That is a liability in this business. Or it's the reason the valley still has its trees, Adeline said. Something moved in Lenora's expression. Not agreement. But not dismissal either. Denver, she said, and turned to the carriage. Ronan appeared beside her as the carriage rolled away. What did she say? That you think too long and act too slowly, Adeline said. She said that since I was 12, he watched the carriage until it was past the first bend. She's not entirely wrong. She's wrong about what it costs, Adeline said. He looked at her. Thinking slowly is only a liability if you're operating on someone else's timeline, she said. She spent 20 years on the board's timeline. You've been on the valley's timeline. Those are different clocks. He was quiet for a moment. When did you decide that? Last night, she said. At the map. She told him about the conversation with Aldrich. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. And then he said, You think he can be moved. I think he's not as settled as he presents, she said. That's not the same thing, but it's something. The 6 remaining days before Denver were the kind of days that she would think about later as the period when something shifted between them, though she couldn't have pointed to a single moment and said, there. It happened in the accumulated hours of working at the same table on the same problem, in the arguments that had gotten past their first formality into something more genuinely contested, in the particular shorthand that developed when two people spent enough time working together that they stopped needing to explain context. She found herself watching him differently, not the assessment she'd done in the first days, cataloging, calculating, but something with more texture. She noticed that he made coffee badly and drank it anyway. She noticed that the old gray dog, whose name turned out to be Porter, followed him specifically, not the room in general, and that this told her something about how he spent his time when no one was watching. She noticed that he checked the workers' cabins every evening on his way back from the mill, a quick walkthrough that he did without announcing or making a ceremony of it, just a man making sure things were all right before he came inside. She noticed that he had started leaving her coffee in the morning before she got to the kitchen. Not making a point of it, just it was there. She didn't say anything about it. But she noticed, on the 5th day before Denver, a second letter arrived from Ruth Calloway. This one was shorter. It said that 3 of the Carver Creek families had made arrangements to travel to Denver at their own expense, and that Ruth herself would be among them, and that they expected to be treated as what they were, citizens with legitimate grievance and not as a dramatic prop. Adeline read this and felt something that was partly relief and partly the particular weight that came with knowing people were depending on you. She wrote back, "You will be treated as exactly what you are. I will make sure of it." She showed the letter to Ronan that evening. He read it and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "You did this," he said. "Ruth Calloway did this," she said. "I just wrote a letter." "You wrote a letter in the right direction," he said. He looked at the letter again. "Adeline, if this goes wrong in Denver, if Lenora's legal challenge holds and the board votes." "It won't hold," she said, "but if it does, Ronan." She met his eyes. "I read the clause. The remedy provision is clear. It requires recognized territorial service or community standing. We are about to walk into a room with the territorial commissioner present and testimony from 5 settlement families and a documented record of remediation payments that your attorneys can reframe as proactive community responsibility." She paused. "The challenge will not hold." He looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she said, "but it's clear there's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she held it back. And then he looked down at the letter again and said, "We leave day after tomorrow." "I know," she said. "I've been packed since yesterday." Denver announced itself before they arrived in it, the smell of coal and a city's worth of fires, the sounds that accumulated at a distance and resolved into individual things only as you got close enough. Adeline sat in the carriage Ronan had arranged for the city leg of the journey and looked at streets that were busier than anything she'd seen in 3 years of near isolation, and felt the particular sensation of a person whose internal landscape had expanded in a way that external landscapes now had to catch up to. She had been to Denver once as a child. She remembered it as overwhelming. It was still overwhelming, just differently, not because it was large, but because every person on every street was conducting their own entire life simultaneously. And the compression of that many lives into one city block was a specific kind of noise. The hotel was Ronan's usual choice, not the grandest in Denver, but not modest either, a solid establishment that communicated stability without display. The staff knew him, treated him with the respectful ease of a long-standing account. She watched how he moved through the lobby and thought about the man who had stood on her porch in a worn coat and worn-out hat, and how she had not entirely disbelieved that version of him, even now that she knew the other one. Both were true. She'd figured that out somewhere on the road between the valley and the city. The board meeting was the following afternoon. The morning was for preparation, and she used all of it. She met with Ruth Calloway and the 3 Carver Creek families at 8 in the morning in a small parlor off the hotel lobby that Ronan had reserved for the purpose. Ruth was a woman around 40, compact and direct, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of her life outdoors and the exact quality of stillness that Adeline recognized as a person who had learned to be very careful about where they put their energy. The families were a mixed group, a husband and wife, with the specific exhaustion of people who had driven 2 days through early winter, a younger man who introduced himself as the Carver Creek schoolteacher, and an older woman named May who said almost nothing in introductions but whose eyes were sharp and whose presence had a specific gravity. Adeline explained the situation without simplifying it. She told them about the inheritance clause and the remedy provision. She told them about the board composition and Lenora's strategy and what she understood of Aldrich's position. She told them what the meeting would look like and what would be asked and what she needed from them. "What we need," she said, "is for the commissioner to hear you directly. Not summarized, not footnoted, you. They'll try to manage us," Ruth said. "Not a question, they will," Adeline said. "They'll be polite about it. They'll offer you seats in the back of the room and thank you for coming, and try to make you feel like observers rather than participants." She looked at Ruth directly. "Don't sit in the back." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "Who are you exactly?" she said, not hostilely, genuinely. "I've been trying to figure that out," Adeline said. For about 3 weeks, something in Ruth's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, the precursor of one. "Don't sit in the back," Ruth repeated. Understood. The meeting with the territorial commissioner happened before the board meeting, which was Ronan's arrangement, and which Adeline had suggested 3 days ago in the valley. She had argued that going to the commissioner after the board meeting would look like an appeal, which was a position of weakness. Going before established their position independently, which was something else. Commissioner Hale was a man around 60 broad, with the blunt manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with competing claims and had gotten to the age where he no longer had patience for preamble. He listened to Ronan's presentation of the sustainable cutting model with his hands folded on his desk and his expression arranged into something carefully non-committal. He looked at the drainage maps. He looked at the remediation ledger that Ronan's attorney had reframed in the restatement they'd prepared. He asked 2 questions, both specific and technical, and listened to the answers. Then Adeline said, "Commissioner Hale, there are 4 families from the Carver Creek settlement in this building who have traveled 2 days to speak with you. They've submitted written testimony. I'd like you to hear them before the board meeting this afternoon." Hale looked at her. "Mrs. Blackthorn, Commissioner. This meeting was arranged as a consultation on operational matters. The operational matter has downstream consequences for settled families under territorial jurisdiction," she said, "which makes it a matter of recognized territorial service, which is directly relevant to the legal question the board will raise this afternoon." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to take a position. I'm asking you to have complete information." Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ronan. Then he looked back at her. "Send them in," he said. Ruth Calloway sat down across from the Territorial Commissioner of Colorado and told him about a fence. She didn't dramatize it. She described it the way she had in her letter, specifically, without embellishment, with the accumulated frustration of someone who had been dealing with a preventable problem for 8 years and had simply stopped pretending it wasn't preventable. The school teacher described the water quality in the lower creek in the spring of 1883. The husband and wife described what it had cost them in livestock and a ruined garden. May, who had said almost nothing all morning, spoke for 90 seconds with the precise, flat delivery of someone who had chosen each word in advance. And what she said in 90 seconds was more damaging to the expansion proposal than everything else combined. Hale listened with his hands still folded. He asked the school teacher one question. He thanked each of them. After they left, he sat for a moment. Then he said, to the room generally, "What does the expansion contract look like if the east slopes are excluded?" Adeline had the revised production estimates ready. She'd prepared them 2 nights ago. She put them on his desk. He looked at them. "Still profitable," he said. "Significantly," Ronan said. "Less than the full proposal, but sustainable over 40 years rather than 6. Hale picked up the revised estimates, set them back down. "I'll be at the board meeting this afternoon," he said. "In my official capacity as territorial commissioner." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The board meeting was held in the private dining room of a building 2 blocks from the hotel, which had the specific atmosphere of rooms that powerful people used for decisions they didn't want, witnessed heavy curtains, dark furniture, no windows facing the street. The board members were already seated when Ronan and Adeline arrived, which was Lenora's arrangement and which Adeline had expected. There were 6 board members plus Lenora, Whitmore and Fairchild she recognized. The other 4 she'd reviewed from Ronan's files, 2 men who generally sided with Lenora on operational matters, one who had been a consistent supporter of Ronan's approach, and one who was genuinely undecided and whose vote, she had calculated, was the one that mattered most if things were close. Aldrich was present, seated to one side, not at the table observer position, technically. His expression gave nothing away. Commissioner Hale arrived 3 minutes after they did and sat at the end of the table without being invited to, which was the specific behavior of a man who held sufficient authority that he did not require invitation. Lenora noted his presence with a look that processed its implications before her expression settled back to pleasant. She looked at Adeline with a fractional narrowing of the eyes that communicated, "You arranged this." Adeline held her gaze and said nothing, which communicated yes. The meeting opened with the operational presentation Whitmore, reading from the prepared board summary, which framed the expansion proposal in exclusively financial terms and was genuinely impressive in its comprehensiveness. The numbers were good. She understood why reasonable people looked at those numbers and found them persuasive. Ronan presented the alternative when his turn came. He was clearer than he'd been in any of the practice iterations she'd pushed him through over the past week. She noticed with the specific satisfaction of a person who had argued with someone until they got better at arguing. He addressed the 20-year comparison directly, presented the drainage evidence, and referenced the remediation payments as proactive management of long-term liability without either apologizing for them or hiding them. Then Lenora raised the inheritance clause. She did it gracefully, which was her skill framing the legal challenge not as an attack but as a procedural matter of board responsibility. She cited the charter language with the precision of someone who had spent time with lawyers. She noted that the primary heir's recent marriage had been conducted without board notification, in circumstances that had not been fully disclosed to a party with no connection to the territorial business community. She was careful not to say anything untrue. She was also careful to let the implications sit in the room and do their work. Whitmore produced the legal brief. It was thorough. Lenora's legal counsel had done real work on it, and Adeline recognized that work because she'd read the original charter herself, and she knew which parts were solid and which parts depended on interpretation. The clause requires, Whitmore read, that the primary heirs union demonstrably strengthen Blackthorn timber through recognized territorial service or standing in the community. "We have a response to that," Ronan said. Lenora looked at him. "Ronan, this is a procedural matter, the remedy provision," Adeline said. The room looked at her. She had not spoken until now by deliberate choice. She'd sat beside Ronan and listened and let the board's case build. She had watched Hale's face during the presentation, and she had watched Aldrich's face. And she had waited for the exact moment when Lenora's challenge was fully laid out and the room understood what was at stake. The third paragraph of the second page, she said. The charter also specifies the conditions under which a challenged union can be validated by the board without requiring review of sole authority. She didn't produce a document. She'd read it often enough that she didn't need to. Recognize territorial service. If the territorial commissioner, present in his official capacity, acknowledges a contribution to community interest, the challenge is resolved. Lenora said, "The interpretation of recognized." Commissioner Hale, Adeline said. She looked at him directly. "You heard testimony this morning from 4 families in the Carver Creek settlement regarding the downstream consequences of timber operations on the slopes above their community. You reviewed the Blackthorn Valley drainage documentation. In your assessment, do the conservation practices at Blackthorn Timber under current management represent a contribution to territorial community interest?" The room was very quiet. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the board. Then he said, in the blunt way of a man who had stopped having patience for performance, "They do." Unambiguously. One of the undecided board members, Thornton, she'd identified him from the files as a man who had built his own business from a small start and had a particular sensitivity to being on the wrong side of something that would be obvious. In retrospect said, "Commissioner, in your view, would the full expansion proposal as currently structured present concerns for territorial land use?" Hale looked at the question for a moment. The east slope drainage situation would require significant review before I could support a clearing operation of that scale, he said. The watershed impact on settled communities downstream is a matter of territorial interest. Aldrich, from his observer seat, said, "If the east slopes are excluded from the contract, I'd need to revisit the projections with my investors." Lenora looked at him with the expression of a woman whose chess piece had just moved in a direction she hadn't planned. "Carver," she said, "the watershed review is a legitimate concern," Aldrich said, with the precise neutrality of a man who had just made a calculation. "We don't want to be 3 years into an operation and facing a territorial injunction. That's a cost that doesn't appear in the current projections." The undecided board member spoke again. "What's the projected return on the modified proposal? East slopes excluded." Ronan's attorney produced the revised estimates, the same ones Adeline had given to Commissioner Hale that morning. Thornton read them, passed them to the member beside him. Lenora was watching the room. Adeline watched Lenora watching the room and saw the moment when the older woman understood that the vote she'd been counting was no longer the vote she was going to get. It was a small moment, a micro-adjustment in posture, a quality of stillness. Nothing that anyone not specifically watching for it would catch. Adeline caught it. "The board should vote on the expansion proposal as modified," Thornton said. He said it to the room, not to Lenora, which was its own statement about the shift in the room's gravity. East slopes excluded pending watershed review. Whitmore looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up, and her expression was arranged, and her voice was even when she said, "The inheritance challenge." "The commissioner has spoken to that directly," Ronan said. "In his official capacity, the remedy provision is satisfied." The board's legal counsel's interpretation, Lenora. It was Thornton. Quiet, not unkind. "The commissioner is sitting at this table." A silence. "The full expansion proposal should not go forward without the watershed review," Aldrich said. He said it like a man who had been thinking about drainage maps since the night before and had arrived at a conclusion he was going to state plainly rather than dress up. "That's my recommendation to my investors." Lenora looked at him. It was the look of a woman who understood that the support she had counted on had just reorganized itself around a different center of gravity, and that there was nothing to be done about it in this room today. She looked at Adeline, and Adeline looked back, not with triumph, because she had learned young that triumph shown too openly just made enemies more determined. She looked at Lenora the way she'd looked at Gerald Pruitt standing in her cabin doorway, steadily, without flinching, with the specific quality of a woman who had decided where she stood and was not moving. The vote on the modified proposal was 4-2 in favor. The inheritance challenge was formally set aside by board resolution pending no further contest, which Whitmore recorded in the minutes with the careful neutrality of a man who had recognized which way the room had moved and had adjusted accordingly. Lenora voted against the modified proposal. She was precise and professional about it. She shook hands with Commissioner Hale. She nodded to Ronan. She looked at Adeline for a moment with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Adeline had seen from her, and what was in it was not defeat exactly, it was something more complicated. The particular quality of a woman who had come to a fight expecting one opponent and found herself contending with something she hadn't fully anticipated. She left without further comment. The room dispersed slowly, in the way of rooms after significant things have happened, and everyone needs a moment to reorganize their sense of what comes next. Aldrich shook Ronan's hand and said, "I'll be in contact about the watershed review. The modified proposal may still work." He looked at Adeline. Mrs. Blackthorn, and then he left with his alert eyes and his recalibrated calculations. Commissioner Hale stopped at the door. He looked at Adeline. "That advisory program you mentioned to me this morning," he said. "Proposal connecting timber operators and settlement communities and territorial inspectors. I'd like to see that in writing." She hadn't mentioned it to Ronan yet. She'd thought of it at 2 in the morning 3 nights ago and had been turning it over since. "I'll have it drafted within the month," she said. Hale nodded once. Left, Ronan turned to look at her. "Advisory program," he said. "It's an idea," she said. "When did you— 3 nights ago?" He looked at her for a moment. "You've been here less than a month, I'm aware." "Adeline." He stopped, started again. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I have made a significant number of decisions in my life that I was certain about," he said. "About this valley, about this company, about what I was trying to build." He held her gaze. "I was not certain about you. I had a strong instinct and I acted on it. And there's a difference between certainty and instinct, and I want to be honest about which one it was." She looked at him. "But I want you to know," he said, "that I have never in this valley, in this company, with anyone in my life, I have never had a partner." He said the word carefully, like he was weighing it. "I didn't know what I was missing until I had it." The room was empty now except for them, the heavy curtains, the dark furniture, the residue of a significant afternoon. She thought about what to say. She had a lot of things she could say. She had gotten better at not saying all of them at once. "You thought too long and acted too slowly," she said. He looked at her. "About everything except me," she said. "You were decisive about me." Something moved in his face. That thing that looked like the younger version of him, unmanaged, real. "I was," he said. "Yes, don't lose that," she said. "The rest of it you can work on." She picked up her coat from the chair and put it on. The green shawl that had been Caroline Blackthorn's was underneath it, and she straightened it at the collar. "We should find Ruth Calloway," she said. "I told her we'd report back." "Yes," he said. "And Ronan," he was pulling on his own coat. He stopped. "Next time you have an idea about what I should know or not know," she said. "About anything. The company, the valley, what Lenora said to you in a hallway, tell me." He held her gaze. "Agreed. I mean it more than I meant it the first time," she said. "I know," he said. "So do I." They walked out of the heavy curtained room together into the cold Denver afternoon. And she found Ruth Calloway in the hotel parlor drinking coffee with the specific expression of a woman who had been waiting long enough that she'd gotten past impatience into something calmer and more durable. Ruth looked up. "Read their faces." "Well," she said. "The east slopes are protected," Adeline said. "The watershed review will take at least a year. Pending that, no clearing operations above the creek." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the fence?" Adeline sat down across from her. "I need to talk to you about something called an advisory program," she said. "And I need your help building it." Ruth set down her coffee cup. "I'm listening," she said. Outside the hotel windows, Denver moved in its compressed, noisy, layered way, all those lives conducting themselves simultaneously. And Adeline Crowe, who had left a small Colorado settlement with one bag, and nothing decided, sat across from a woman who had been waiting 8 years for someone to listen. And she thought about Eli's drawing in her coat pocket, the mountain and the small figure at the top, and the word underneath it. She was not going back to what she'd been. That was not what come back meant. She was going to bring something back with her. The ride back from Denver took 2 days, and for most of the first day, neither of them talked much. That was not uncomfortable, the way silence had been uncomfortable on the first ride, when she'd been cataloging a stranger and trying to find the edges of what she'd walked into. This was different. This was the silence of 2 people who had just come through something together and needed time to let it settle before they could talk about it properly. She'd noticed that about herself over the years, that she processed things on a delay. that the real feeling about an event often didn't arrive until the event was over and the adrenaline had cleared, and there was nothing left to do but sit with what had happened. What had happened was large enough that she was going to need more than one day to fully know what she thought about it. Ronan drove, the same attention on the road, the same clean efficiency with the horses. But something had shifted in the quality of his presence beside her. He was less guarded, she thought. Or maybe she had just gotten better at reading him. Around midday on the first day, he said, "What did you tell Ruth about the advisory program?" "The outline," she said. "Not the details. I don't have all the details yet." "Walk me through what you told her." So she talked, and he listened, and by the time they stopped for the night at a way station, she'd built the shape of it clearly enough that she could hear where it was strong and where it still had gaps. The idea was a connecting structure, not an office, not an institution, something more like a regular meeting point where timber operators, settlement representatives, and territorial inspectors could share information before problems became crises. Where a family in Carver Creek could report what they were seeing in their water quality and have someone who spoke the timber company's language hear it. Where a mill operator could understand what his cutting decisions meant 2 valleys downstream before the damage was done. "It needs someone to run it," she said. "Someone who can speak both languages." The business side and the community side. "You're describing yourself," Ronan said. "I'm describing a role that doesn't exist yet," she said. "I'd be the first person to do it, which means I'd also be building it as I go, which means it'll be wrong in the first version and need fixing." She paused. "But Commissioner Hale wants it in writing within the month, so I don't have the luxury of waiting until the idea is perfect." He was quiet for a moment. "It won't be popular with every timber operator in the territory." "No," she agreed. "Some of them will see it as interference. Most of them will see it as interference. Then we'll have to demonstrate that it's useful before they decide it's a threat," she said. "Start with the ones who already have an interest in not having a territorial injunction slow their operations. Self-interest is a better motivator than principle, usually." He looked at the fire. "That's a cynical view. It's a practical view," she said. "I don't need people to be good. I need them to see that a particular action serves them. And if it doesn't serve them, then I need to change what serves them," she said. "Or I need to find the ones for whom it already does and build from there." She looked at him across the fire. "You've been doing a version of this for 4 years. Quietly, alone, with no structure and no support, and no one to hold the line when you were in Denver dealing with investors." He turned the cup in his hands. "Yes, that's why it's taken 4 years and you're still fighting the same fight," she said. Not harshly, just plainly. One person alone can hold a position. A structure holds it after that person is gone. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled. "My father would have hated this idea," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I read his correspondence. He believed the valley was its own argument. That if you ran it right, it spoke for itself." "It did speak for itself," she said. "That's why Hale was useful today. But the valley can't walk into a boardroom. Someone has to carry it." Ronan looked at her. Something in his expression had the quality she'd seen a handful of times now, that younger, unguarded version of him that came out when he stopped managing his face. "You're going to be very difficult," he said. "I've been told," she said. "I mean that as I'm not sure what I mean it as," he said. "Something good." She looked at the fire. "I know," she said. They got back to Blackthorn Valley on the second afternoon to find Mrs. Holt Margaret standing on the porch with an expression that communicated she had been watching for the wagon since morning and was not going to admit it. Porter the dog was beside her, his gray muzzle pointed down the road, and his tail moved exactly once when the wagon came into view, which was apparently his version of enthusiasm. "Well," Margaret said as they came up the steps. "It went well," Ronan said. "I didn't ask," she said, but something in her face loosened. She looked at Adeline. "There's a letter, came yesterday." Adeline knew before she took it. The handwriting on the outside was Eli's. She could identify it by the size of the capital letters. Opened it on the porch. It was 2 pages this time, which was unusual. Eli's letters were normally short, compressed by the effort writing cost him. This one was longer, and she understood why when she got to the second paragraph. Their father had had a bad week. The Denver doctor's medicine had stopped being as effective, and he'd had 3 nights in a row of the wet cough that frightened her, and Eli had written it down carefully and factually the way she'd taught him to write things he needed to tell her, without drama, just the facts so she could understand clearly. Clara had added a note at the bottom in her smaller, neater hand. He asked for you yesterday. We told him you were coming back. She stood on the porch with the letter and let the cold air move around her and thought about her father's hands on the blanket, how thin they'd gotten. Thought about what coming back meant when the situation you were coming back to was different from the one you'd left. I need to go to Cinder Hollow, she said. Ronan was beside her. She hadn't heard him move. When soon? She folded the letter carefully. Not today. I need to write to the Denver doctor first, get his assessment. And I need to leave the advisory program draft in a state where it can sit for a week without losing momentum. She paused. But soon I'll take you, he said. She looked at him. I've never met your father, he said. It was simple. Not a gesture, not a performance, just a fact about an omission that he was apparently done allowing. She thought about that for a moment, about what it would mean to bring Ronan Blackthorn to the cabin in Cinder Hollow, about Eli meeting him and Clara measuring him with those careful eyes, about her father in the back room, smaller every week, asking for her. All right, she said. The week that followed was the kind of week that looked ordinary from the outside and wasn't. She wrote to the Denver doctor and received his reply. In 4 days, the medicine needed adjustment, which he could manage through correspondence with a local physician if she could identify one near the settlement. She wrote to Cinder Hollow's doctor, who was the same traveling man who had left the original medicine, and told him in plain terms what the Denver physician required and why, and told him she would pay his fee directly. She finished the first draft of the advisory program proposal and sent it to Commissioner Hale with a cover letter that was careful and specific, and took her 3 attempts to get right. Hale's acknowledgement came back in a week with 2 questions that were genuinely engaged rather than procedural, which told her something about his level of interest. She also wrote to Ruth Calloway, establishing what would become a regular correspondence, not just about the advisory program, but about what was happening in Carver Creek, what the water quality looked like as the season changed, what the families were dealing with. She had an instinct that the program would only be useful if it stayed grounded in what was actually happening in actual places to actual people, and Ruth was the best ground truth she had access to right now. Harlan came to her one morning near the end of that week. He knocked on the door of the room she'd been using as a workspace, a small room off the main hall that had been a storage room, until she'd had cleared it out and put a desk in it and stood in the doorway with his ledger under his arm and his. Expression doing the thing it always did when he was dealing with something he hadn't decided how to categorize yet. Mrs. Blackthorn, he said. Harlan, come in. He came in but didn't sit down. He was a man who made decisions about sitting carefully. I wanted to speak with you about the production schedule for the eastern section, he said. Now that the board has agreed to exclude the east slopes pending the watershed review, we need to adjust the winter cutting plan. I know, she said. I've been looking at the numbers. If we shift the northwest section to compensate for the volume difference, we're about 12% short on the Grantham contract delivery. He looked at her. Yes, he said after a moment. That's correct. Is the Grantham contract penalty clause activated at 12% short or 15? A pause. 15, he said. We're within the tolerance. Then we need to notify them early and offer a credit on the next delivery, she said. Before they notice the shortfall, that way it's goodwill instead of failure. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. I was going to propose the same approach, he said. I know, she said. I was going to talk to you about it today. Another pause. The quality of it was different from the pauses she'd gotten from him in the first weeks. The advisory program, he said, the one you're drafting for the commissioner. Yes, it would require the operators to share production data with the territorial office. Selectively, she said, impact-relevant data, not full production records. Some operators are going to see it as surveillance. Some operators are clear-cutting slopes above settlements and blaming the settlements for their water problems, she said. Those operators should be surveilled. He absorbed this. And the ones who aren't will have a record that says so, she said. Which protects them if someone ever makes that accusation. She looked at him directly. Harlan, I know you thought this valley's approach was sentimental. I know you thought Ronan was leaving money on the table. He opened his mouth. I'm not criticizing it, she said. I'm saying I know, and I want you to know that the numbers bear him out over 20 years. Not over 2, but over 20, she paused. You're good at this operation. I've seen what you do with the mill schedule, and I'm not going to pretend I could do it better. I'd like us to be able to disagree about the philosophy and still work together on the practice. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his ledger, then at her. You're going to be here a while, he said. Wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. I am. He nodded once, with the specific quality of a decision being made rather than a point being conceded. The Grantham credit, he said. I'll draft the notification today. Thank you, Harlan. He left. She sat for a moment and thought that this was the kind of thing that never got dramatic and was sometimes more important than the things that did. She and Ronan left for Cinder Hollow on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Denver. Margaret stood on the porch again with Porter, and again she didn't say she'd been watching for them to leave. But she pressed a wrapped package into Adeline's hands before she climbed into the wagon and said, For the children. Shortbread. Don't let them eat it all at once. Thank you, Margaret. Don't thank me, she said. Just come back at a reasonable hour. They were going for 3 days. Adeline didn't point this out. The road back to Cinder Hollow was different, going down from what it had been going up. Not the road itself, the road was exactly the same, rutted and cold and serious about the switchbacks. But she was different, and the mountain was the same size it had always been, and those two things together produced a different experience of the journey. She had gone up this road afraid of what she was walking into, with one bag and a decision she was still testing. She was coming down it with 11 weeks of a life that she hadn't predicted, carrying shortbread and a draft of an advisory program, and 7 signed statements from Carver Creek families, and sitting next to a man who had turned out to be considerably more than his worst coat. Cinder Hollow looked smaller than she remembered, which was not a surprise, but was still a strange thing to feel. Places shrink when you leave them, or you grow, or both, and the result was the same either way, a slight dissonance, a sense of standing in 2 times at once. Eli saw the wagon from the fence line and came running, and the sight of him running all 9-year-old legs and no coordination, and the same absolute commitment to full speed that he'd had since he could walk, hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force she hadn't prepared for. She was down from the wagon before it fully stopped. He ran into her like a small projectile, and she caught him and held on, and he said her name twice, quickly, like it needed saying twice to be real. She held on for a moment longer than she needed to, because 9 years old went fast, and she knew this, and she was not going to be careless about it. Clara came from the cabin door. More measured. Because Clara was always more measured, she walked quickly, but she didn't run. And when she reached Adeline, she put her arms around her without drama and held tight, which was Clara's version of running. You're thinner, Clara said into her shoulder. I've been busy, Adeline said. That's not a reason to be thin. You sound like Margaret, Adeline said. Who's Margaret? She pulled back and looked at both of them. They had both grown, she thought, though it was hard to measure from inside it the particular growth of children who were taking on more than they should and aging at the edges because of it. She felt a familiar, complicated feeling about that, the guilt and the necessity of it, tangled together in a knot she'd been carrying for 3 years. Ronan had climbed down from the wagon and was standing a few feet back, giving the reunion the distance it needed. She looked at him and then at Eli, who was now looking at Ronan with the direct appraisal of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't assessing people. "That's him," Eli said, not quietly. "That's him," she said. Ronan walked forward and crouched down to Eli's eye level, which she noticed and filed. "I'm Ronan," he said. "I've heard about the drawings." Eli considered this. "Which ones, mountains?" Ronan said. "Figure at the top. That one's not very good," Eli said. "My proportions were off. I thought it was effective," Ronan said. Eli looked at him for another moment with that unfiltered assessment. Then he said, "You're bigger than I thought. Addie's letters said not imposing, and I wasn't sure what that meant." "Eli," Adeline said. "It's fine," Ronan said. He stood. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with those careful eyes from behind Adeline's shoulder. "Clara," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "Your letters are the clearest writing I've seen." Clara blinked. "You read them?" "She reads them aloud sometimes," he said. "When she's working late." Clara looked at Adeline with an expression that Adeline couldn't quite read, something between surprise and the careful reassessment of someone updating their picture of a situation. "Father's awake," Clara said. "He was asking about you this morning." The cabin was the same, and it wasn't. She noticed things she hadn't noticed before she left: the way the light came through the single window, how low and pale. The gap in the fencing she had meant to fix for a year and hadn't. The smallness of it, not in a diminishing way, but in the way of something that had been exactly the right size for what it was and what it had contained. Her father was in the back room, sitting up in the bed rather than lying flat, which was better than Clara's letter had prepared her for. He had the specific alertness of a man who had spent enough time sick to know how to manage his energy carefully, when to rest and when to be present. He had decided to be present for this. "There she is," he said. His voice was thinner than she remembered, but it was his voice. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand and didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't a right thing to say first, and she'd learned that sometimes the first thing you said set the tone for the whole conversation, and she wanted to get the tone right. "You look different," he said. 3 months in a mountain valley," she said. "Different light, not the light," he said. He looked at her for a moment with the particular perception of parents who had watched their children long enough to read changes that weren't visible. "Less afraid," he said. She thought about this. "I had things to be afraid of," she said. "I was just afraid of different things." "Are you all right?" he said. "Truly, yes," she said. And then, because it was her father and he could tell when she was simplifying, "It's harder than I thought it would be, and better than I expected." Both at the same time. He nodded like this was something he understood. "And the man? He's in the other room meeting Eli, which is either going well or badly, and I genuinely don't know which." Her father's face shifted. The smile that appeared was not the full smile she remembered from. Before he got sick, it had less range now. The muscles slower, but it was real. "Bring him in," he said. Ronan came into the room with the particular quality she'd noticed when he was in a situation that required care, the same attention he gave the road, given instead to a person. He shook her father's hand, sat when her father gestured to the chair, and answered the questions her father asked him with the plain honesty he gave to everything, including the parts that didn't show him at his best. Her father asked how they had met. Ronan told him, accurately, including the worn coat and the deliberate concealment, and her father listened and looked at him steadily, and then said, "She accepted, so I assume your reasoning was sound." "It was flawed reasoning that produced the right outcome," Ronan said. "I've thought about it since. And the debt," her father said. "You cleared it." "Yes," before she agreed. He wasn't making it a question. "Yes." Her father was quiet for a moment. "That matters," he said. "The before part." "I know," Ronan said. They stayed in Cinder Hollow for 3 days. She fixed the fence on the second day, finally, with Eli handing her tools in the specific way he had of being helpful that was 60% useful and 40% in the way. And she didn't correct the ratio because the 40% was his company, and she had missed it. Ronan spent most of the second day with her father, in conversation she wasn't always part of, and when she walked past the door of the back room in the afternoon, she heard them talking about timber and soil in a way that sounded easy, like two people who had found the subject that connected them. She found Clara on the evening of the second day, sitting by the cold fire in the main room with a book, an actual book, which was new. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "Mrs. Hendricks," Clara said. "She's been lending them." She looked up. "Addie, the settlement school is getting a real teacher in the spring. Not just Mrs. Hendricks when she has time, an actual hired teacher." "I know," Adeline said. "I had something to do with that." Clara blinked. "How?" "Blackthorn Timber sponsors 3 territorial schools," she said. "I reallocated part of the community contribution fund. It'll continue for 4 years minimum." She sat down across from her sister. "I should have told you when I arranged it." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Is that what you do now? Reallocate funds?" "Partly," she said. "Mostly I'm trying to build something." She paused. "Clara, when the spring comes and the school is settled, I want to talk to you about coming to the valley." Clara went very still. "Not permanently if you don't want," Adeline said quickly. "But you're 14. You need more than what Cinder Hollow can give you educationally. And there's a school at the valley now." She stopped. "There's a school at the valley now," Clara said. "There will be," Adeline said. "By spring, I'm working on it." She met her sister's eyes. "It's something I want to build, for the workers' families and for others." She paused. "I want it to exist before I invite you to use it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She had her mother's way of looking at things, measuring them quietly before she responded, never reactive, always considered. "You sound like you're running something," she said. "I think I might be," Adeline said. "I'm not entirely sure yet." "Are you happy?" Clara said. It was so direct and so simple and so absolutely Clara that it stopped her for a second. She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything stripping back the surface to find what was actually there. She thought about the East Room and the early mornings with coffee and the map on the wall of the main room with Ronan's pencil marks on every drainage line, and the conversation with Harlan about the Grantham contract, and Ruth Calloway's letters, and the sound of Ronan laughing in Denver, surprised by itself. "I think I'm becoming something," she said. "I'm not sure happy is the right word yet. But I'm right. I feel like I'm in the right place, doing the right things." She paused. "That's different from happy. I'm not sure it's less." Clara nodded slowly. "I think Mama would have liked him," she said. Adeline looked at her. "Ronan," Clara said. "He fixed the door hinge this afternoon. The one you've been meaning to fix since the winter before last." She said it with the matter-of-fact observation of someone who had watched a detail and drawn a conclusion from it. He didn't say anything about it. He just found the tools and fixed it. Adeline was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I think she would have." On the third morning, she sat with her father one more time, alone. He was tired from the 3 days of more activity than he usually had, and she could see the tiredness in the way he held himself, but his eyes were clear. "You're going back," he said. "Not a question. Tomorrow morning," she said. "Good," he said, which surprised her. "Don't stay longer than you should." "You have things happening, Papa." "I know what I am," he said. Not bitterly. "Practically, I know what the situation is. The doctor's medicine is helping, and I have the children, and I have the cabin, and I don't need you standing watch." He looked at her. "I need you to do whatever you're doing up there, because whatever it is, it's the right thing." "How do you know that?" she said. "Because you look like your mother looked when she'd made up her mind on something worth her time," he said. She had a quality about her, like she'd found the right altitude. He held her gaze. "You have it now." She took his hand and held it, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't a better thing to say than what he'd just said, and she'd learned not to cover good things with more words. The drive back to Blackthorn Valley was quieter than the drive to Cinder Hollow had been, but it was a full quiet rather than an empty one. She had been to a smaller place and come back to a larger one, and the transition needed processing. Around midday, she said, "He likes you, your father?" Ronan said. "Yes, he's a careful man," Ronan said. "He asks the right questions." "He always did," she said. "Before he got sick. He hasn't stopped," Ronan said. "He's just slower about it." She looked at the road ahead. "I want to build the school," she said, "at the valley. I know we've talked around it, but I want to commit to it. Spring. I have a timeline in my head. Tell me. A building by April, we can use the crew from the east cutting section, since they'll be light on work during the review period. A teacher by May. I have a contact through Ruth Calloway, a woman who's been teaching in a settlement 2 counties over and who wants a permanent position." She paused. "It'll cost—" "I know what it'll cost," he said. "Do it." "You didn't let me finish. You've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and you've been careful about everything you've proposed so far," he said. "I don't need the number first." She looked at him. "I trust your numbers," he said simply. That sat in the air between them for a moment. Not lightly with the weight of what it meant, which was more than just the school. "The advisory program's first meeting is in March," she said after a moment. "Commissioner Hale confirmed it yesterday, before we left. 3 timber operators, 2 settlement representatives, and a territorial inspector." 3 operators, he said. "Who?" "Blackthorn, obviously. A man named Carver from the South Range, who I've been corresponding with. He's been dealing with a flooding problem, and I think he's beginning to understand why. And Aldrich's company, because Aldrich asked to send a representative." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich's company is participating." "I was surprised too," she said. "He wrote to me last week. Apparently the Watershed Review has his investors asking questions about liability on their other operations." She paused. "Self-interest," she said. "Better motivator than principle." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "You said that before. It keeps being true." They came over Blackthorn Pass in the late afternoon, and she watched the valley open below them, the same way she had the first time, that same moment of the land revealing itself. The managed trees and the buildings and the lodge at the far end on the rise. It hit her differently now, not smaller, not less impressive, but known. The difference between seeing a landscape and living in one, between being astonished by it and being responsible for it. She thought that might be what home actually meant, not the place that astonished you, but the place you'd taken on. "Ronan," she said. "Yes, the dangerous workers' cabins," she said. "The ones on the north row. I've been putting off raising it because there's always something more urgent, but we're going into the hardest part of winter, and 2 of those roof lines are wrong." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "Yes, this week," she said. He sighed, not with frustration, with the sound of a man who had just had the last of his procrastination removed by someone with less patience for it than he had. "This week," he agreed. She nodded. The wagon started down into the valley, and she could see lights coming on in the windows of the Lodge Margaret, starting the lamps. The next several months unfolded in the way that real things unfold, which is to say without clean lines or satisfying progression, but with a kind of cumulative momentum that only became visible in retrospect. The north cabin roof lines were fixed in the first week of December, and the 2 families living under them did not say much about it, but Cade Sorrells, the older of the 2 brothers, stopped being formally polite to Adeline and started being something more like direct, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The school building went up in March, slower than planned because of a late ice storm that cost them 2 weeks, and required a redesign of the foundation drainage, which Adeline managed with Ronan's help and a great deal of assistance from a Carver Creek man named Thomas, who had come up for the advisory program's first meeting and ended up staying 3 extra days because he knew something about foundation work that they needed. Ruth Calloway came for the school opening in May and stood in the finished building with her arms crossed and looked at the rows of desks and the slate board and the window that faced east and said, "It's not fancy." "No," Adeline agreed. "Good," Ruth said. "Fancy falls apart." The teacher they hired was a woman named Florence Marsh, no relation to the Reverend in Cinder Hollow, who had been teaching in a two-room settlement school for 6 years, and who arrived at the valley with a trunk of books and an opinion about everything, and got along immediately with Margaret in the way of two women who had decided simultaneously that they were both correct about most things and would therefore get along fine. Clara came in June. Not permanently, Adeline had not pressured it and would not have but for the summer to see. She arrived with a second trunk that was heavier than her first, and immediately enrolled in Florence's summer sessions, and within a week had opinions about the reading list that Florence received with the specific delight of a teacher encountering a student who pushed back. Eli came with her and spent the summer following Cade and Pete Sorrells around the mill operation, with the absolute commitment of a boy who had found something that interested him completely and was going to extract every piece of information from it until nothing was left. By August, he could read a production log and explain a drying schedule, and had very specific opinions about the Northwest Timber section that he delivered to Ronan one evening at dinner, with such earnest precision that Ronan listened for 20 minutes without interrupting, and then said, "You're right about the second section. I've been thinking the same thing." Eli looked like he'd been handed something fragile. He nodded, carefully, like he didn't want to disturb it. Their father came in August, when the weather was at its gentlest. The Denver doctor had adjusted his medicine twice more, and the wet cough had quieted to something drier and more manageable, and he had enough of his strength back that the journey over the pass was difficult but possible. He sat on the porch of the lodge on his first evening and looked at the valley and didn't say anything for a long time. "You built something," he said finally. "We're building it," Adeline said. "It's not built." "No," he agreed, "but you can see the shape of it." She looked at the valley in the evening light, the school building at the north end, new lumber still pale against the older structures, the workers' cabins in the north row with their corrected roof lines, the east drainage channels that Ronan had been extending and improving all spring, small engineering of it, invisible from here, but present in the numbers and in the creek below Carver Creek that Ruth said was running cleaner this year than in 8 years previous. The managed trees in their deliberate spacing, not stripped, not exhausted, still standing. She had thought, in the beginning, that she was buying her family's survival. That was what she'd told herself on the porch in Cinder Hollow, with the fire poker in her hand and the cold coming through the gap in the door. A practical transaction, a survivable arrangement. She hadn't been wrong exactly. Survival had been part of it. But survival was the floor, not the ceiling. The advisory program met quarterly now. The March meeting had been 3 operators and 2 settlement representatives and a territorial inspector. The June meeting had been 7 operators, 5 settlement representatives, 2 inspectors, and a letter from Commissioner Hale that referenced the program by name in official territorial communications, which was the kind of recognition that Adeline did not make a ceremony of, but which meant that the structure was now something other than one woman's idea. Aldrich's representative at the June meeting was a young man named Perry, who asked better questions than most of the operators, and who, at the end of the day, offered to facilitate a meeting with 2 railroad company executives who were starting to think about the long-term land implications of their expansion practices. She had not fully known what to do with that, and had told him so directly, which seemed to be the right answer, because he'd written a thoughtful follow-up letter that she was still considering. Lenora had not contested anything after Denver. She had not withdrawn from the board either. She attended the July meeting in person, by correspondence from Ronan, who reported it with the neutral tone of someone waiting to see what it meant. Adeline had written Lenora a letter in April. Not conciliatory, she hadn't done anything that required conciliation but direct. She had outlined the modified expansion plan and its current status, the watershed review's preliminary findings, and the advisory program's first meeting results. She had treated Lenora as what she was, a board member with legitimate interest in the company, and had given her the information a board member needed. Lenora's reply had come 2 weeks later. It was one paragraph. It said that she had reviewed the preliminary watershed findings and found them thorough, that she considered the modified expansion approach worth continuing to evaluate, and that the advisory program represented an interesting model for territorial operations, whatever her reservations about its origins. The last line said, "I underestimated the comprehensiveness of your preparation. I do not often make that error twice. It was not an apology." Adeline had not expected one. It was something more durable than an apology. It was a woman who played the long game, acknowledging that the board had changed, that the valley had changed, and that the person who had changed it was not going away. She put the letter in the secondary ledger, the one Ronan had started with the quiet payments to the downstream settlements. She kept both ledgers together now, in the same drawer, because they told the same story, the story of what this place had been trying to be before it had language for it, before it had structure, before it had someone to carry it into rooms where decisions got made. Ronan found her there one evening in September, in the small office off the main hall, with the ledgers open and a letter from Ruth Calloway on the desk, and Florence's school enrollment numbers in the corner, and the first draft of the October advisory meeting agenda in front of her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He did that sometimes, stood in the doorway and looked at her working, not interrupting, just present. She had stopped noticing it at some point, which meant she had also stopped finding it strange, which meant something about what they had become to each other over 9 months, that she didn't always have words for, but which she recognized the shape of clearly. "The October meeting agenda," he said, looking at the desk. "Ruth wants to add a standing item on water quality monitoring," she said. "Think she's right. We don't have a consistent measurement standard yet." "She's usually right," he said. "I've noticed. Don't tell her that," she said. "She'll raise her expectations." He came in and sat in the other chair. Looked at the enrollment numbers. 14 children, he said. "Florence wants to add a second session in the spring," she said. "If we can get a part-time second teacher. She has someone in mind, one of the Carver Creek women who did 3 years of formal schooling in Denver before her family came west." "Do it," he said. "You keep saying that. You keep proposing things that are right," he said. "What else would I say?" She looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked tired in the specific way of a man who had been working hard for a long time and had stopped pretending otherwise. He'd been out on the northwest section all day, she knew, because Cade had mentioned it at dinner, and because his coat still smelled of cold wood. "The northwest section," she said. "Cade's assessment was right," he said. "We need to adjust the cutting pattern. I've been putting it off because the production numbers." "I know," she said. "I've been looking at them. If we phase it over 2 seasons instead of addressing it all at once, the production impact is manageable." He looked at her. 2 seasons. "The way you phase all the adjustments you don't want to admit need making," she said. "You think I don't notice. I think you notice everything," he said. Accepted it. She set down the pen. "Ronan." He waited. 9 months ago," she said, "I stood on a porch with a fire poker and a debt I couldn't pay, and I made a decision in the dark that I still don't entirely understand." She held his gaze. "I don't regret it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it to reassure you," she said. "I'm saying it because I don't say it often enough, and that's a thing I'm going to work on." He looked at her with the expression she had finally found a word for, sometime in April, in the middle of an argument about the foundation design for the school. The word was home, not the place, the quality, the thing that meant she could stop performing steady and just be whatever she was that day. "The things you said you'd work on," he said. "Yes." "You have a list," he said. It was not quite teasing. More like the specific ease of a man who knew something well enough to be amused by it. "I always have a list," she said. "Am I on it?" She picked up the pen again. "You were on the first version," she said. "You've improved enough that you got moved to the follow-up column." He made that sound again the not quite law. She had learned not to be surprised by how much she liked the sound of it. "That's either progress or demotion," he said. "Progress," she said. Demotion is when I stopped tracking it. He stood, looked at the desk, the ledgers, the letters, the agenda, the enrollment numbers. Looked at her. Come to bed at a reasonable hour, he said. Define reasonable. Before midnight. That's aspirational, she said. He left. She heard his steps on the stairs, unhurried, the particular rhythm of them she could have identified in a crowd. She heard Porter's nails on the floor below, following as always. She turned back to the desk. There was more to do. There was always more to do that was not a complaint. It was the nature of building something real, which never reached a point of completion so much as a point of ongoing maintenance, an occasional improvement, and the slow accumulation of something that would outlast the people who started it. The advisory program needed its October agenda finalized. The school needed its spring planning. The Northwest section needed its two-season adjustment. The Carver Creek water monitoring needed a standard. Ruth Calloway needed a response to her latest letter, which had 7 practical questions and 1 personal one buried at the end. How are you? Actually. She picked up Ruth's letter and read it again. How was she, actually? She thought about her father on the porch in August, saying, "You can see the shape of it." She thought about Eli at dinner with his careful opinion about the Northwest section, and Ronan listening for 20 minutes. She thought about Clara in Florence's summer sessions, pushing back on the reading list with that measured, considered quality she'd had since she was 4 years old. She thought about Margaret in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, coffee already made. Her way of saying, "You belong here," without ever saying it in those words, because she was not a woman who said things in the obvious way, when the less obvious way would do. She thought about a wagon on a frozen road going up into mountains she didn't know yet, and a man in a worn coat who had crouched down to a 9-year-old boy's eye level because it was the right thing to do. She had entered this valley believing she was buying survival. She had been wrong about that, and the being wrong about it was the best thing that had happened to her. She wrote back to Ruth, "I am, actually, well, not finished nowhere close, but well. The shape of it is becoming clearer. More next month at the meeting. I want to tell you in person about the water monitoring standard because you'll have opinions, and I'd rather hear them directly than in a letter." She paused. Then she wrote, "You were right in your first letter. Don't let them bury it in a footnote. That was the right instruction, and I have been trying to follow it." She put down the pen, looked at the lamp, looked at the window beyond it. Dark now, the valley outside invisible but present in the way of things you know well enough that you don't need to see them to know they're there. She was not the woman who had stood on the porch in Cinder Hollow with a fire poker. She was not a lesser version of that woman, either. She had not left anything behind, not the practicality or the stubbornness or the capacity for stillness when things were falling around her. But she was more than that woman. She had been made more by the particular friction of this place, and these people and this work, the way most real things are made, not smoothly, not quickly, not without cost. Blackthorn Valley was not what she had thought it was when she first saw it from the top of the pass. It was not a hidden kingdom, not a wealthy man's refuge, not a prize. It was a place that had been trying, imperfectly and expensively, to be something worth holding on to. It needed someone to say so in rooms where decisions were made. It needed structure and language and the specific kind of stubbornness that didn't flinch when the room looked at you like you didn't belong there. She had those things. She had always had them. She had just needed a mountain to put them to work on. She closed the ledgers, put Ruth's letter with the others, turned down the lamp. Outside, somewhere in the dark valley, the trees stood in their deliberate spacing, not stripped, not exhausted, still standing. The creek below Carver Creek ran cleaner than it had in 8 years. The school building sat at the north end with its east-facing window waiting for morning. The fence in Cinder Hollow was finally fixed. She went upstairs. She had work to do tomorrow, and the day after that, and for a long time after that. The work was real, and it was hers, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly the right altitude.